So it's so amazing to see you all here, and you're so welcome to Bealtaine 2022. My name is Tara Byrne, and I'm the Artistic Director of Bealtaine, which is produced by Age and Opportunity. And we're Ireland's national and only festival which celebrates the arts and creativity as we age. And what that means is it provides opportunity like this, which brings together women of all ages and men of all ages, but particularly over 50, to share our stories. And I think that that's very relevant to today's discussion. So this afternoon, we are so delighted to be hosting this really important webinar, Restoring Aging, as part of Bealtaine with NUIG, National University of Ireland, Galway. Representation in all its forms is a subject that's central to us in Bealtaine, and particularly when it concerns how older people, and in this instance, older women, are portrayed. We know that cultural norms and tropes are created through histories and literatures which invisibly shape the popular imagination around our everyday concepts. And so exploring how older women have been portrayed in culture and continue to be portrayed helps us understand where certain stereotypes about women and femininity may have come from, and underlines the importance of creating new narratives through life writing, as Restoring Aging has done. So this partnership is bound up very much in Bealtaine Festival's own interests and questions around identities in older age. And thus we were so interested to collaborate and work with the creators of Restoring Aging, who are Dr. Michaela Schrage-Frueh, School of Languages, Literature and Cultures, NUI Galway, Dr. Maggie O'Neill, the Irish Centre for Social Gerontology, NUI Galway, and Karen Hanrahan, the University of Brighton, and currently a visiting scholar at the Moore Institute, NUI Galway. And before I hand over to Michaela, there's just a few housekeeping things which I'm going to run through very quickly. So the event will run until 6 o'clock with a short break just before 4 p.m. During the talks, please make sure that you're muted with your camera turned off, but please feel free to use the chat function to contribute comments and questions. There will be some opportunities for group discussion at intervals using the raise hands function. If you leave the Zoom, we can't guarantee re-entry, although we will keep an eye on the waiting room. But if you're taking a break, it might make sense to and we recommend muting your microphone and switching off your video, but staying logged on. And please note, as Maggie said earlier, we're recording the webinar. So that's it. Over to you, Michaela. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tara. Thanks very much. So I'm keeping myself very short. Just a few words of welcome after Tara's kind introductory words, and then I will move straight on to introduce our first speaker. So my name is Michaela, and I would like to welcome you all to this webinar also on behalf of my colleagues and co-organizers, Maggie and Karen. And we will be leading you through the program today. And I would also like to start by thanking the Irish Research Council for their generous funding, but also our partners, Age and Opportunity, with whom we had such a wonderful collaboration, and the participants of a focus group and a creative life writing workshop led by Éilís and Dhuibhne, the PPI contributors who advised on the project, and finally the Moore Institute at NUI Galway. So the title of this webinar, as Tara just said, is Restoring Aging, Older Women and Life Writing. And it's the final event of a project of the same title that Maggie, Karen and I conducted in partnership with Age and Opportunity. So we will briefly introduce this project in the second part of this webinar. But the idea behind it is that we are all in a way storied by popular, often stereotypical media images and narratives that can shape, influence our ideas about our own aging, and that are very often also gendered. And if we critically engage with and respond to such stereotypes, as well as engage with lesser known narratives and subjective experiences of aging, then we might be able to some extent to reshape, reclaim, or restory our own narratives of aging. And the first part of this webinar will address this idea in a number of talks by writers, activists, and researchers who will engage with older women's life writing in the broadest sense of the term, ranging from conventional memoirs to self-representations on social media. The speakers in this session are Ashton Applewhite, Dr. Áine Léime, Éilís and Dhuibhne, Professor Molly Andrews, Dr. Mary McGill and Helen O'Reilly. And we will have opportunity for questions after Ashton's talk and again at the end of the panel. Feel free to write any questions in the chat throughout. In the second half, after a short break, you will be treated to some of the truly amazing results of a creative life writing workshop led by Dhuibhne and conducted in the context of this project. Some of the participants of this workshop have kindly agreed to read out their own work and to discuss their experience of participating in this. But now, without further ado, it's my great pleasure and honor to start by introducing our keynote speaker, Ashton Applewhite. Ashton is an internationally recognized expert on ageism at the forefront of the emerging movement to raise awareness of ageism and to dismantle it. Her book, This Chair Rocks, a manifesto against ageism, was published in 2019, and it was described by author Anne Karpf as, and I quote, packed with provocative and liberating ideas to make you leap into the air with pleasure, even if your knees, like mine, are a little dodgy. Ashton is a co-founder of the Old School Anti-Ageism Clearinghouse, and she speaks widely at venues that have included the United Nations and the TED Mainstage, and she has written for Harper's, The Guardian, and the New York Times. She has received numerous honors. In 2022, she has appeared on Help Age USA, an inaugural 60 over 60 list of Americans who are making significant contributions to society at the local, national, or international level. And she has received the prestigious Marie Kuhn Award from Presbyterian Senior Services as a, quote, visionary leader, author, and advocate in combating ageism. Today, Ashton will share with us her doubtlessly mind-blowing thoughts on aging well female, and we are very, very much looking forward to her talk. The floor is yours, Ashton.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure to be with all these women from around the world. My talk is called Aging While Female Reimagined, which is a reference to the phrase driving while Black here in the US, which you may have heard because people who are Black and at the wheel are pulled over by police so much more often than what their white counterparts, so that just being what we are can be a risk factor in this society. And I have to admit that I delayed writing this talk for a long time. And I thought it was because I didn't know where to start. And finally, I started where it hurts, the mirror. I used to think that I was the only person who looked at her reflection and thought, what the hell happened? And now I know that seeing the face in the mirror as alien may be the most universal manifestation of internalized ageism. The feeling that our bodies are betraying us simply because they're changing, and that's not us. And of course, the mirror thing happens to men too, but to grow up female in this youth and beauty-obsessed Western culture is to bring years of judging and being judged to that mirror. And as we age, we tend to experience a growing disconnect between how we feel on the inside, youthful, ageless, powerful, and the self we imagine the world is seeing in that harsh light, imperfect, overweight, maybe undesirable. It is hard to change these ingrained ways of thinking. So throughout this talk, I'm going to ask you to do two things with me: suspend judgment and imagine. Let's start by looking at some of the ways women try to cope with aging. We buy into what anti-aging products promise. We fudge or lie about our age. We get lifted and tucked and plumped. Not all these things, of course, but none of us are immune. We do these things as a way to reconcile the gap between that face in the mirror and how we actually feel and what we aspire to. We do these things to keep our options open. In an ageist and sexist society, women's access to opportunity depends a lot on what she looks like, the roles she can play, the jobs she can get, the ponds we can swim in. I completely understand why so many of us mask or deny our age. No judgment, the stakes are high and the conditioning runs deep. We need to remember that this culture's obsession, and when I say this culture, I guess I'm referring, to sort of the West in general. Our obsession with how women look is not about beauty. It is about power. It underlies what cultural critic Susan Sontag called the double standard of aging. I know, shocker, right? The social convention that aging enhances men up to a point, but progressively destroys a woman. Quote, women reinforce it powerfully with their complacency, with their anguish, with their lies, she wrote. In protecting themselves as women, they betray themselves as adults. Ouch, at least that's how I felt when I read that the first time. We perpetuate this every time we walk in a room and rank other women by age, which we all do. No judgment. Imagine. We can wean ourselves from these thoughts and behaviors that reinforce the double standard because they cost us so much. Age denial is expensive. The anti-aging piece of the beauty industry in the US alone is worth billions. And because more older people are women and many of us have spending power, we represent a market that is going to become ever more important in the worst way. Age denial is futile. The only product that prevents wrinkles is sunscreen. And the more we invest in expensive anti-aging remedies, the more money we waste and the harsher the reality when they fail, as they inevitably do. Age denial is rooted in shame and judgment, as when we've learned a lot about this, I think, from the body acceptance movement. We fawn over women who age gracefully, and even more who seem not over the ones who seem not to age at all, in popular culture. It's not your fault if you're queer or have a disability, although there's judgment around that too. But shame on the woman who lets herself go. Age denial also leaves stereotypes in place. It is really hard not to feel complimented when someone says, you look great for your age, or you don't look your age. But we can only accept that compliment at the expense of other women who don't happen to look quite as good, or who may never have been visible in that way. It reinforces the mother of all ageist assumptions, which is that younger equals better. It reinforces the idea that people your age look a certain way, and it deprives others of the evidence that age stereotypes are false. When we misrepresent our age, we're not undoing age stereotypes. We're just saying they don't apply to me. Age denial also obscures what is uniquely valuable about being older. That word agelessness, I see on the chat someone named Molly Andrews who has written about that, whom I quote in my book. It sounds so seductive. It is what countless magazines and beauty products urge us to aspire to. But agelessness strips us of our years, all the things we've done and been that make us who we are. Age denial also makes it impossible to define aging on our own terms, whatever they happen to be, and harder to learn as we go, to be receptive to the rich possibilities that age brings. And I think this is especially true for women. The costs are higher, but so are the rewards: confidence, self-knowledge, perspective, and freedom. Age denial also leaves class out of the picture. When you search stock photo libraries for images of women aging gracefully, I have a slide about this, but I didn't want to use the whole PowerPoint. You get an array of gray-haired white women smiling against pastel backgrounds. The notion that how gracefully or successfully we age is up to us, a matter of individual responsibility, assumes a level playing field, access for everyone to gyms and sushi and leisure and help with caregiving and decently paying jobs that feed retirement accounts. And needless to say, women are less likely to have access to all those things than men, and less access if they are not white, less access if they are non-disabled, if they are disabled, and so on. Age denial gives discrimination a pass. Dyeing our hair just to cover the gray or leaving early accomplishments off our resumes are really successful strategies. Again, I completely understand why so many people do these things, but these behaviors aren't good for us because they're rooted in shame about something that shouldn't be shameful, and they perpetuate the underlying discrimination that makes these behaviors useful. And for people who face other kinds of discrimination, like queer women, women of color, the costs are all even higher always. Age denial sustains patriarchy. A patriarchy is a society in which men have more power and systematically deny power to women. We live in one. Women participate in patriarchy by accommodating and upholding male power. For example, over half of white American women voters chose an overtly racist president who bragged about sexually assaulting women, and not once but twice, preferring the shelter of patriarchy and of white supremacy, white privilege, over solidarity with their Black and brown sisters. Accommodating patriarchal norms by being quiet, pretty, accommodating, so on, all these things we are conditioned to be, is a way to take whatever power we can from this system and use it to our best advantage. And it works, but not forever, and it reinforces a system that exploits and devalues us. Just a few points about prejudice as a whole. All these systems, racism, sexism, homophobia, are not about biology. They're not about how we look. They're about power, and they operate by pitting us against each other so that the status quo is unthreatened. Like working moms arguing with stay-at-home moms about who's a better mother, instead of joining forces to close the gender wage gap so women could choose whether or not to stay home. And I won't even talk about reproductive rights. I'll just smack my head again. It's mortifying to be American. Prejudices intersect and inform each other, and we see this in the way the harshest form of ageism is aimed at women and the most ruthless form of misogyny reserved for the old. This patriarchy ushers women on stage in our early teens and ushers us off it in midlife, if not before, depending on what you do and your culture and your circumstance. Women are never the right age. In the workforce, we are too cute and sexy to be taken seriously. Then we're too fertile, and then boom, we're not sexy or fertile anymore. And that's that. Why is simply calling someone an old woman an insult? Why is there granny bashing? I don't know if that's a term you're all familiar with. And you never hear about grandpa bashing. Why have we laughed along? Why have we allowed this? Because sexism alone, if we see how ugly the underlying misogyny is and how deep it runs, is a terrifying subject. Misogyny is dislike, contempt, or ingrained prejudice against women. Pair it with ageism, which we're just beginning to confront, and the full truth is immensely painful. And just the way older people can be ageist, in fact, often the most ageist of all, women can be misogynist, another painful fact. Entire industries are built on promoting fear and loathing around women's aging, encouraging young women to perceive my 69-year-old face and body as hideous. This condition is so deep that it's hard to envision a different way of being in the world. But none of this is natural, watch out for that word, and none of it is fixed. Not that long ago, it was considered unnatural for white middle-class women to work outside the home, for Black and white people to be friends, for gay people to make lives together, for people with disabilities to be out in the world. Change is slow, but it is real. The critical and hardest starting point is to look at our own attitudes, in this case, towards age and aging. Excuse me. To look for ways in which we are ageist instead of for evidence that we're not. We can't challenge bias unless we're aware of it. Everyone is biased some of the time, and these are new ideas to a lot of us. No judgment. Sexism and ageism are built into the way organizations, institutions, and social networks work. This creates structural inequality as opposed to internalized, and it is the reason that men and women experience aging differently. Gender and age intersect in different ways, affecting every corner of our lives everywhere on the planet. Worldwide, and it is fantastic to see women on this screen from all over the world, we are less likely to be educated, which reduces our access to jobs and healthcare and our ability to shape our own lives. Widows and unmarried women are particularly vulnerable and subject to abuse, and the effects on our income, our health, and well-being add up over time. And like in every domain, they are further compounded by race and class, which is why everywhere in the world, the poorest of the poor and sickest of the sick are old women of color. This is a lot to overcome. It can feel like trying to lift a boulder, but we don't have to lift it alone. We have heroes and visionaries and each other and people attending and organizing this event that want to draw on the incredible unequal strength and voice of older women. And we also have consciousness raising. That was the tool that catalyzed the mainstream women's movement in the 70s. And what happened was that women came together and compared their stories from their personal experience and realized that what they had been thinking of as personal problems or maybe flaws in themselves, like not getting heard or getting hired or being respected, were actually widely shared social and political problems that we could come together and do something about. And consciousness raising is the first step in a process of social change that involves conversation, collaboration, activism, art, advocacy, meetups like this one, and eventually legislation, and maybe a little revolution in there. Only a few of us are going to take it that far, but if you want to start a consciousness raising group, go to Old School. I'll paste the link in the chat, the Old School Clearinghouse, and download a guide called Ageist, Sexist, Who Me, which will enable you to explore the way ageism and sexism intersect. But if all you do is push back a little bit when someone says you look great for your age, that is completely valid. Any little thing we do to change the way we think radiates out because we're different in the world. So if someone says you look great for your age, try responding, you look great for your age too. No judgment. Imagine. It is time to mobilize against ageism the way we did against sexism, and to do better than your American sisters did 50 years ago. Their activism was ageist because it focused on women of reproductive age and consigned older women to the margins. The movement was overtly racist in its early days and has long focused on the interests of white women. It was also homophobic. In the 1970s, it was the fact that women's movement didn't address their issues that compelled Black and queer women to invent intersectionality and demand that we address the way different components of people's identities inform the way we are in the world and our access to opportunity and privilege and health and all the things. If we want true women's liberation, white women like me for sure, must learn to give up those privileges, that we keep in mind the way problems play out differently for different people, and that we aim for remedies that do not come at the expense of other women, like electing Trump. The purpose of consciousness raising is for women to identify experiences that unite us without ignoring our differences. Categories like gender and sexual orientation and class and ethnicity may set us apart, but they're also important vehicles for collective identity, right? We have to hold those two truths in our head at once, which is hard. The only effective and lasting way to advance equality is through solidarity and collective political action. We still have a long way to go, but again, no prejudice is natural. None of this is fixed. And just as different forms of prejudice intersect, so do different forms of activism. When we chip away at any piece of it, we chip away at the fear and prejudice that underlie all prejudice. And a world that is better for older women is, simply put, better for everyone. The women's movement taught many of us to claim our power, and a movement against ageism will teach us to hold onto it. So, how can we get old and stay powerful? Couple of suggestions. We get old and stay powerful by coming together in groups of all ages. Having significantly older or younger friends is important in 1,000 ways. What young woman hasn't been shut down by an older one who felt threatened or was just being mean? What older woman hasn't gotten a side eye or felt pity, even contempt, coming from younger women in the room? Having younger friends reminds older women how hard it is to be young. And if more younger women hung out with older ones, they'd see how much we enjoy being our age and how liberating and empowering we think it is. As is, younger women retain power by distancing themselves from older ones, and older women try to hold on to it by denying that we are aging and trying desperately to stay young. You do not need a PhD in feminist studies, which some of you probably have, to figure out that these behaviors are not good for us. They set us up to fail. They prioritize appearance. They yoke power to conventional sex appeal, which means looking young. And that gives us women a very short and shaky window of opportunity to make our way in the world on those terms. and they give discrimination a pass. No judgment, but let's imagine something different. Do we want to maintain power relations that privilege the male, the white, and the wealthy by continuing to compete, or do we want to subvert them? Do we want to keep colluding in our own disempowerment to dig the hole deeper? And again, we all do these things, and it depends on how we feel when we wake up in the morning and what's happening in our lives. So no judgment around any of this. But another option, instead of digging the hole deeper, is to throw away the damn shovel. As is, each generation has to figure out how futile and punishing it is to fear aging and how much of our youth we waste on worrying about it. It is time to unite and break the chain. This means bringing women together, reaching across age and race and class, which is not easy, to work on new ways of thinking and behaving. We need female solidarity from birth to death, from diapers to menstruation to menopause, and back to diapers again, if that's how it turns out. And to be able to cast a wide net, lifelong, right, to our friends, not just our biological family, and not just our daughters. Aging is inevitable. Ageism is not, and a global movement to dismantle it is underway. Go to Old School, the Old School Clearinghouse, oldschool.info, and check out the campaign section. Many of the very best are across the United Kingdom, where I think the preponderance of you all are listening. A system designed to exploit our insecurities only works if we go along with it. We can't change the way we look at ourselves, at each other, and how we value what we see. We can insist on being seen and represented and respected as our full, rich, lumpy, complicated selves and take that change out into the world. We can move if we have the will and the desire and the vision. Imagine. From competing to collaborating, we can turn it from a conversation about scarcity and loss to one about empowerment and equity, and we can change the world simply by taking that attitude out into the world, and of course, in lots of other ways. We get old and stay powerful by mobilizing against ageism as well as sexism. So, what change would each of you like to see? Who will you reach out to across the generations to make it happen? I can't wait to hear from the stories that follow how all of you are doing this, and I am with you in this struggle. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Ashton. Wonderful talk. So many things. We need more time for discussion, quite clearly.
I'll come back. I know, and thank you for allowing a political opener. I know sometimes people think I'm going to be yelled at or whatever, but we need to, of course, it's from the women's movement that the personal is political, the political is personal.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, you brought together all the different kind of facets of internalized ageism, structural ageism, together misogyny. So it all really the whole intersectional aspect of ageism and discrimination of older people, that is of course not the same for everyone, but also depends on class, social class, on race, on other factors. Disability would be another one.
And ageism cuts both ways. It's any judgment on the basis of age. So young people experience it also, although less than older people because society is so youth obsessed.
Yeah. It's something that strikes me again and again, the way that people tend to view others through the lens of age, and these compliments that are paid. You don't look your age, or you're 10 years younger, and obviously we are all delighted.
We haven't changed a bit.
And then we wonder, but why? Why is it a good thing to you?
Right. Why do we celebrate the ability to change and grow and adapt through life? And then somewhere like north of middle age, wherever middle age is, we're supposed to stop the clock.
Absolutely. We have some comments and questions in the chat. I just I use my privilege as a moderator to just ask the first one, because we have also been looking at media images in the context of this project. And I was just wondering, do you see a change there? Do you see a change towards the positive in the way that older women are represented in the media globally? Would you say that something is going on there, happening there?
I don't know if research has been done on this yet, but when I started the Old School Clearinghouse, which was simply, I thought, this movement is really new. Wouldn't it have been amazing if the women's movement had a central place to find, really good vetted, videos and talks and, animations, whatever. And at that time, there we had the idea, like, let's have a free image bank of non-ageist photographs and images that people could use. And I'm happy to say that before we got around to it, AARP, the big retirement organization here, collaborated with the Getty Library on creating one. It's expensive. The UK's wonderful Centre for Aging Better has created one. And the American Society on Aging and Shutterstock just launched a guide to anti-ageist imagery. So I think that is pretty good evidence that the culture is changing. I just want to put a little asterisk around positive images. That is often how it is framed. Anyone who puts positive images or messages out there we're all on the same team, which is to counter the prevailing message, which is entirely negative, that everything about getting older is going to be awful, especially if you're female. But it's really, you mentioned the word representation. It is really important to represent older people, which is, and the longer we live, the more different from one another we become. So the older the group, the more diverse it is. That's biology as well as sociology and all the rest. And that means including images of people who are disabled in particular, who are often missing, which I think mainstream people might not think, oh, that's not positive. Well, it's part of who we are. Cognitive decline is not inevitable, but some part of your body is gonna fall apart. So we need to steer clear of all the pastel smiling white ladies who need to be included, but to be represented only in proportion to our numbers, and make sure that all kinds of diversity, in particular disability, because it's so often missing, are represented when we represent older people.
Thanks so much. I think I just had a look at the chat because there's so many comments in there now, and I'm just going to take one of them. We probably won't be able to answer all, but Bridie Leslie Moore wrote, "What is really pernicious is the idea that youthfulness is associated with energy and vitality and enthusiasm, and age is associated with lack of energy, sedentary behavior, depression, and isolation." So what can be done to change that, so that is also part of the positive images that we need to create to counterbalance those one-sided representations?
It is all related. The most important thing any of us can do, of course, is to call out these ageist behaviors, and that's an excellent example when we see them. If the Center for Aging Better, again, and a number of organizations here in the US have created language guides as well as image guides to make sure that age, and again, go to Old School, search for language, you'll find them, they're free, all in one place. So we have the tools, and one thing you could do is point out to the organization or the person, hey, here's an alternative. Another thing, and this is this relates to both our internal attitudes and the way it's manifest in the world, which, as you say, these representations of older people as completely falling off the cliff, when some young people are couch potatoes and some 80-year-olds run marathon, is to think about how we use the words old and young. Because we tend to, no judgment, use old, and you see this a lot where it's viciously problematic in job recruiting and hiring practices, where youthful, energetic is used as a proxy for young. If we say, I don't feel old, what we really mean is that we don't feel washed up, we don't feel incompetent, we don't feel invisible. So use the exact word that you describe, because we can feel any of those things at any age. And if it comes up in conversation, see if you can't say, a really good all-purpose rejoinder or comment on an ageist comment is, what do you mean by that? and get the person, if you can, without making them, feel like you're jumping on them, which is something I'm not all that good at because I tend to be a bull in a china shop. But what do you mean by that? What's the assumption behind that? What's your evidence for that? So that we can question the assumption, the equation of old or older with all these bad things, and the assumption, that young people are necessarily better at technology, or, even I was at a conference once, which was almost entirely older women. There was one young man there, and he could not walk through the room without people asking him for help with their computers. And he's like, I'm not a tech guy. So that's an example of sexism and ageism at work.
That's true. Yeah, I mean, those and most of us have internalized these stereotypes to some
we
extent.
We all have.
It's so hard to overcome this. And thanks so much for also drawing attention to the aspect of language and to choose our words wisely and carefully, and the possibility of kind of restoring our narratives by doing that. And there's
Absolutely.
one example in the chat that where Patricia McGuire writes, when I retired from the university, in inverted commas, I never said I was retiring. I said I was repurposing, trying to control my narrative. So I think that is a very good example.
There is tons of energy around this. And one of the positive aspects of the pandemic, if I can even say that, obviously the pandemic was hideous, and obviously far more hideous for people without privilege, but that a lot of online networks formed. Women have an advantage in aging in that we do form social networks more readily and curate social relationships. And there are tons of conversations like this one around women and aging, starting in midlife, starting with menopause, which has finally come out of the closet, thank God, and on down the line. So we need to tap into our networks. And I would just, as a personal note, say, if you are in a conversation with older women talking about age, it would be fantastic if you did your part to make sure that those conversations are ageism aware, because a lot of them are about how I'm still sexy, or I still look better than the woman in the corner. And while that may make us feel better in the short term, they erode the solidarity that we need in the long run.
Thanks so much. Thank you. I wish we had more time for questions, to be honest. But I think we will just thank you for your, yes?
I just want to say I'm easy to find. I have a blog, This Chair Rocks, and I have a Q&A blog called Yo, Is This Ageist?, where you can submit things that you've seen or heard. I'm on all over social media.
You're on Twitter.
So it's easy to find me outside of this, and I would love to come back.
Exactly. Wonderful. We can put this in the chat. So This Chair Rocks on is your Twitter handle. You're also on Facebook, I saw. So that is brilliant. And thanks so much for your wonderful talk. We were delighted to have you. Such a pleasure. And we will move on to the next speaker now. Thanks very much again to Ashton. And I will hand over to Maggie, who is actually going to announce the next speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Michaela. Thanks, Ashton. That was just enjoyed that so much. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to pass over now to Áine and Léime, who is a senior researcher at the Irish Centre for Social Gerontology in NUI Galway. Áine's research explores the social aspects of aging, including the implications of engaging in creative activities for older people. So I'll pass over to Áine now.
Okay, thanks very much, Maggie. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Okay, yeah. Good. Okay, so I'm really delighted to be here and to be participating in ReStorying Aging today. So as Maggie said, I'm based at I'm Deputy Director at the Irish Centre for Social Gerontology, and I've carried out a lot of research into social aspects of ageing, including creativity in ageing, over the past 16 years. So first, I'd like to say congratulations to Michaela and Maggie for organising this event, which I think is it's both exciting and really important. So I'm really looking forward to the contributions later by Éilís and the other writers. And the talk by Ashton on ageism, it really highlights the stereotypes and the ageist and limiting stereotypes of older people. And these are prevalent in Ireland just as well as everywhere else. So examples of this are, the narrative of decline, which is, it kind of constructs older people as vulnerable and passive and in need of protection. And we really saw an example of this with the cocooning policy that was introduced by the government. So I'll come back to that later. But what I want to do now is just to set this event in the kind of national context and to highlight the really immense benefits of engaging in the arts. So I want to share with you a few of the key messages or findings of the recent Tilda study. That's called Creative Activity in the Aging Population. And that looked at the impacts of engaging in creative activities in Ireland before and during the pandemic. You probably all know that Tilda is a study that looks at surveys older people in Ireland, and it's been around since about 2009. And this report then was commissioned by Creative Ireland and funded by the Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht, Sport and the Media. I love these titles. They're part of the problem is trying to remember all the names. So it was conducted because there was concern that COVID-19 had led to a decline in the well-being of older people due to that policy that I mentioned of cocooning people over 70. So for people not from Ireland, that meant that people over 70 had to stay in their homes. So even if they had been working, they had to stop and stay in their homes. And there were a lot of images related to this. Maggie and I were involved in another project on creative aging. And so there were pictures of people looking out windows, forlornly. And, really, they were really constructed as just being powerless. And they were isolated then as a consequence of that policy. So there's a link to that study, actually. So I'll ask Maggie and Michaela to share it with you. This wasn't a study now that we conducted. I'm just kind of drawing on it to highlight the importance of this event today. So they found that there's really high level of participation in creative activities by the older population, with just over half of people reporting weekly involvement. And this was very high from the age of 50 to 74, but it kind of dropped off after that. And those with those high levels of involvement, they reported the highest quality of life, the lowest levels of loneliness, depression, worry, and stress. And it was also linked to reported enhanced physical and mental health. So I'm sure that's no surprise to any of you who are involved in this project. Looking at the impact of COVID-19 for older people, time spent doing hobbies, crafts, or puzzles increased during the COVID-19 lockdown. And compared with before the pandemic, people who were involved in those kind of activities, they had higher, or people who spent less time doing those activities had higher loneliness, depression, and perceived stress. There were some differences across groups. Those with lower education and income and poorer health were less involved in the arts, and the levels of participation decreased, especially among older people in rural areas, obviously related to that cocooning and the lack of transport and so on. So now I want to share the findings of some of my own earlier research. I conducted a study on the impacts of participating in creative activities as part of the Bealtaine Festival with Éilís O'Shea some years ago. And prior to the introduction of the Bealtaine Festival, it was widely assumed that older people really weren't contributing much to the arts. Really, their only purpose was to be audience members, perhaps. So ours was a qualitative study that asked people specifically how they were affected by actively writing, painting, or engaging in music or dance or theatre, all of which is possible during Bealtaine. So I want to share the thoughts and words of the participants on how their experience of being in a writers' group affected their quality of life and their ability to express themselves. So as many people will know, some of the people interviewed had unhappy experiences at school in Ireland, or had to leave school early because there wasn't free education until 1968, secondary education, I should say. And so that had left them feeling less than confident about their writing, or indeed about expressing themselves. One of the women in the Bealtaine Writers group said before she joined the group, she always felt she should hide the fact that she was a writer. So she said, you'd be kind of ashamed to say you were writing. And I've heard this from other people who say the same thing. However, her experiences of being part of the writers group was really transformative in terms of her ability to express herself. So she put it really simply. She said, I have to say I found my voice since joining this writers group. And another woman then said that after writing in Bealtaine, it gave her the confidence to discuss her work with others and even submit it for a competition. And another person then, more fundamentally a visual artist, she said it altered the way she sees the world. So she said, I think you look at the area around you differently. You look at it with an artist's eye. You're all the time saying, I'd like to paint this or sketch that. So most of the participants said that writing as part of Bealtaine had enhanced their quality of life and their engagement with the world around them. One member of the writers group emphasised that it was this act of sharing their talent in public that enhanced their sense of well-being. She said this festival allows older people to publicly share their talents, which is good for self-esteem. So all of this highlights the significance of today's event, which celebrates women writing their own stories, and it'll enhance the already vibrant contribution of older people to the arts in Ireland. ReStorying Ageing is doing something new by giving a space for women for writing about ageing specifically. It provides an alternative to these narrow social and cultural stereotypes of ageing, such as that narrative of decline I mentioned earlier, or the other one that Ashton also mentioned, older people as wealthy consumers, which is the other predominant image you see. And they're often the main images represented in the media. So it will give us access to more diverse and nuanced narratives of ageing through the voices and words of the women whose stories we'll hear this afternoon. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to the rest of the event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Áine. I'm going to pass straight over to Éilís ní Dhuibhne. Next of all, Éilís has published over 30 books, including 12,000 Days, a memoir, and Look, It's a Woman Writer, Irish Literary Feminisms. And we're incredibly lucky that Éilís has also facilitated the creative writing workshops that were part of this project. Éilís's talk today will focus on older women's memoir.
Thanks, Maggie. So I'll just get. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me? You can hear me. Good. I'll just get started and try to be brief because I know we want time for discussion and so on. So when I was about 40, someone suggested to me that I write a memoir, and I was completely taken aback because I thought of memoirs then as something that only really old people wrote, kind of summing up their lives before they departed life. And I had little interest in it as a genre. I had little interest in reading it. I passed up I just dismissed the suggestion as being somewhat ridiculous. I didn't really recognize memoir as a literary genre. When I was a student of English literature in the 1970s, there was no question of memoir as such. Sometimes memoir is disguised as fiction, and that's okay. I guess I'm thinking of something like Proust's Remembrance of Things Past, which is a novel. But anyway, but memoir was just not there like poetry or novels or plays or the other big genres. I noticed this year that it is on the curriculum for English and UCD, and I guess in other places as well. So a kind of indication that it's being accepted or beginning to be accepted as worthy genre in its own right. Obviously, we've always had memoirs. I'd say in the past, mainly memoirs about the life of kind of celebrity sort of memoirs, in a sense, the life of a writer, of a well-known person, but also memoirs of childhood, like some of us will remember Alice Taylor's To School Through the Fields. In the Irish language, in Irish language literature, the biggest genre in the first half of the 20th century really was memoir. An Talónach, Dhuibhne Fós, Peg, and you could have a very long seminar on misogyny and ageism in the the popular negative attitudes to Peg's memoir, An Old Woman's Reflections, as it's called in the subtitle in English. But I think while they've been around, it's pretty clear that memoir is becoming very popular in Ireland and elsewhere over the past 20 years or so. I haven't got statistics, but I have it, and perhaps they are there, but I have a distinct impression that there are many more memoirs being written recently than before, and a lot of them are being written by women. And I think the difference between the kinds of memoirs, one difference that were written in the past and that are being written now, is that the memoir with a theme has proliferated recently. So memoirs about what I call grief books, memoirs about bereavement, memoirs about illness, memoirs about divorce, and that sort of thing. So in other words, what has always been the stomping ground of women in literature, so-called ordinary life, has become the stuff of memoir. So the story of an event which is experienced by half the population, the death of a partner, is written about, or a cancer experience, or the breakup of relations. I think these kind of, I don't like I've never liked the term ordinary life, especially when it's applied to my books, which has been all the time. I think, but what's so ordinary about it? I mean, it doesn't seem ordinary to me, but ordinary life, I'm using it now myself. Death, cancer, illness, breakups, they've always been written about in fiction. But now I think maybe until recently, such tragedies were considered a bit too commonplace to be worth writing a memoir about, like to be devoting a whole book about. For instance, I'm going to read just a little piece from Penelope Lively's fantastic memoir, Ammonites and Leaping Fish, and it's one of the ones we looked at in the workshop that we did a couple of weeks ago in the Bealtaine Festival. She takes a pretty stiff upper lip attitude to the death of her husband, Jack. She does write about it. She says, "The world is full of widows, several among my closer friends. We have each known that grim rite of passage, have engaged with grief and loss, and have not exactly emerged, but found a way of living after and beyond. It is an entirely changed life for anyone who has been in a long marriage, and a thoroughly commonplace experience everywhere, always. So get on with it and don't behave as if you are uniquely afflicted." And she doesn't write an awful lot more about this enormous life event for her in her book. I think get on with it is the enemy of memoir writing, and perhaps of many other kinds of writing. It's dismissive. It's kind of telling you, shut up. That is not useful for somebody who's going to write. It's not useful information. and I don't think it's the kind of advice that I have ever particularly taken. When my husband died unexpectedly in 2013, I had read there were some good bereavement memoirs around, and I'd read some of them, like Joyce Carol Oates' A Widow's Story, which come out a year or two earlier, and Joan Didion's fantastic The Year of Magical Thinking. And I'd found them interesting when I read them. But after I was in the same boat as Joyce Carol Oates and Joan Didion when their partners died, they were much more than interesting. They became a haven for me, and I sought other memoirs of grief by other writers. Julian Barnes's Levels of Life, C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed, a very early one, and they were my friends during the first year or two of frequently overwhelming grief. So it was partly thanks to that experience that I wrote my own memoir, 12,000 Days. And writing it was therapeutic for me in more ways than one. And this is kind of a bad admission for a writer, but I've always been skeptical about the idea that writing should not be therapeutic for the writer, and that if it is, it's somehow devalued, and somehow that is not great art. That's a big subject which we can discuss perhaps later. But I did find it therapeutic. I mean, first of all, writing a memoir gives feelings words. Shakespeare says something like, "Give sorrow words, the grief that does not speak knits up the o'erwrought heart and bids it break." So, I mean, Shakespeare is already onto the talking cure or the writing cure a couple of centuries before Freud more or less says the same thing. So writing about a traumatic event is a cure. Or it's a help in some way, maybe not a cure, but I found it therapeutic, and I believe it just is. That works. But what you've got when you do that is the raw material for your book or your essay. And I think after that, the work of shaping the raw material into a book, into an essay, into a memoir that others may find readable, is also therapeutic, in the way that I believe most work, especially creative work, is. I think any fulfilling work is actually therapeutic for the person who's doing it. I mean, somebody says, "Il y a deux choses, l'amour et le travail, après ce rien." And, you know, there's something to that. So I believe memoirs are good for the writer in more ways than one, and they're also good for the readers. And for some readers, they may be more than just a good read. They can provide solace of a kind that is not easy to find elsewhere. So in the past 10 or 20 years, I've come across several memoirs by Irish women. Leah Mills' In Your Face, An Account of Cancer, Sinead Gleason's Constellations, very recent, many people know about that, also about chronic illness. Emily Pine's Notes to Self, about various aspects of a woman's life, caring for a parent, problems with reproduction, periods, all that sort of thing. In the past few months, I have read, mostly for review, a number of memoirs by women. Amy Bloom's In Love, a memoir of love and loss. Anne Ingalls' Open Hearted, her life story, but also involving love and loss. Alana Hopkins, A Very Strange Man, about her husband Aidan Higgins and her relationship with him, and her experience of bereavement. Just this weekend, I've been reading one called Old Rage by Sheila Hancock, a really kind of interesting memoir about being angry when you're almost 90, mostly about angry at things like Brexit and so on, but also she recounts the experience of being what somebody was talking about there, the way older people were kind of treated during the COVID pandemic and so on and so forth. And you'll all be able to add many titles to that list. I no longer read memoirs as I did in the years after my husband died for comfort, but I still love them and I find them completely enthralling. And I'm also getting interested in, and I should also add to those memoirs, that are published books by various authors, that my experience of facilitating some memoir workshops over the past 2 years, like the one that we just did recently as part of the Bealtaine Festival, Restoring Aging, have genuinely been among the most interesting workshops, and I say it without any, not boasting in any way about myself, but because of the way the students, mostly women, in fact, nearly all women, in the Bealtaine one and in others, that they were the most successful ones. I mean, they seem to kind of work in a way that other workshops may not, or something about the experience of writing about and sharing memories and experience of life created an atmosphere in those classes that wasn't like anything I've ever come across. And that was on Zoom. I mean, the sort of personal relationships that developed for the course of the workshop were unusual in their strength, I thought. So just to close, I'm beginning to get interested in the genre of memoir as a literary form or an art form. As I mentioned earlier, it's nice that life writing memoirs are now being studied as part of the English literature program in universities, where certain genres have always got preference on the syllabus and of course in the canon. So I guess it will take a little time for memoir to become recognised as real literature. And only last week I read the following in an article in the Irish Times by Cormac McMahon, and I'm just going to quote here. It hardly seems necessary, given the variety and abundance of excellent memoir writing, to warrant a defence of the form. Yet Melissa Phoebus finds, even after years of writing, publishing and teaching, that she still encounters a bias against it. In her latest book, Bodywork, she recounts examples of where she meets resistance in the classroom, at conferences, among other writers, even other writer friends. For Phoebus, there's something more sinister at play beneath seemingly harmless sneers about writing as transformation, catharsis, or even therapy. She argues that insights gleaned from lived experiences are political. Writing is a form of freedom more accessible than many other forms, she says, and there are forces at work in our society that would like to withhold it from those whose stories most threaten the regimes that govern this society. It's quite a mouthful, ordinary stories threatening regimes, but they can do that, and in quite obvious ways if they're critical of, say, the health system or housing or so on, as they are sometimes. I wonder though if the big threat in memoir is that they can be emotionally raw, and they threaten people who need to keep emotion under wraps. And I think even under wraps in a story or a sonnet or a play or something, I think fiction protects everyone by claiming to be made up, even when it has close connection to fact. I mean, in fiction, fact can be presented as fiction, and that's what happens. But the opposite can be the case in memoir. it's selective and memory can be false, but even if it's fiction, and it's never all fiction, it's presented as fact, it's presented as the truth. And I think maybe that's what's scary about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Éilís, that was wonderful. And next I have the pleasure of introducing Molly Andrews, who is Honorary Professor of Political Psychology at University College London and co-director of the Association for Narrative Research and Practice. Her research explores the implicit political worldviews which individuals impart through the stories they tell about their lives, as well as the wider social and political context which makes some stories more tellable than others. Molly's work has been translated into Finnish, Chinese, German, Spanish, Czech, and Swedish. And the title of Molly's talk today is "We Had the Dream, Narrating a Life of Activism in Hindsight." So thank you, Molly, and over to you.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this. It's really a wonderful gathering. And I have to begin with an apology, which is that I am actually visiting my 96-year-old father, who I'm about to take to the doctors in about a half hour. So if I can come back afterwards, I will. But anyway, I wanted to really begin by saying what a wonderful introduction Ashton and the others have given to us, but particularly Ashton resonates with a lot of the points that I want to make here. And one in particular, my offering is slightly different because it's about a study that I've been conducting over the last 30 years. But before I do that, I want to actually say that I sort of came to the, if you want to say, general field of being an aging scholar, if that's what I am, I don't really know, really through the back door. I was in my mid-20s and had grown up in Washington, D.C. with very politically active parents, had always been involved in political protest of one kind or another. This was in the late 60s in Washington. And what I found really, really strange as I was getting older was, why was there this story about old people who were sort of disengaged people? Somehow this idea that, the G.B. Shaw quote that if you're not a socialist before you're 30, you have no heart. And if you are a socialist after you're 30, you have no mind. And I thought, this is strange, because actually all these protests I've gone to, there's tons of people, not just old people, but people of every age. So in fact, that's what I did my PhD on, what sustains commitment to working for progressive social change over the course of a lifetime. And that was really an incredible gift to myself, if you will, because I set myself up for years of talking with incredibly inspiring, still very politically active people between the ages of 75 and 90. So that is sort of and Ashton in particular was talking about the importance of intergenerational relationships. Well, that's absolutely what was at the heart of my study, and indeed my own convictions. And that has really stayed with me. That's some 35 plus years ago. And ironically, as I'm giving this paper right now, just by chance, in my view to my left, I'm overlooking what was my grandmother's apartment where I grew up as a very young child. Now I live across the ocean now, but I feel sort of like I'm channeling that because we spent so much time in that particular place. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the research this project that I've been doing over the last 30 years, if you will. My most recent thing that I've written about, I called The Long Conversation, because this was in fact, a research project that was never meant to be longitudinal. And can you see that all fine now? Yeah. So great. Okay. Is it okay? Great. Is the side view there, or just the main slide?
Yes, we can see the side view.
That's not what I want. So let's put it on. Okay. I'm going to unshare for 1 second and put it in the right mode. Because I think I have to do it that way. And sorry, and share screen. And is it still the same? Ah, well.
It is, unfortunately, yeah, it's still the same.
Okay, well, anyway, that's fine. You'll see what is coming here. So to tell you a little bit about this study, this was actually, this slide represents sort of more my ongoing research. And again, Ashton was already talking about the importance of imagination. And I want to emphasize here, for me, the question was not only about imagination going forward, like being able to imagine what kind of, in my case, politically engaged older person I want to be, but indeed actually imagination going back, so that we are, as the title of this meeting suggests, sort of restoring also our past. So back 30 years ago, I started a study in the former East Germany. It was 3 years after the fall of the wall. And in this case, I was interested, definitely not in aging, as it were, but actually looking at what happens to political identity and commitment when a country disappears, okay? And again, it was progressive social change that I was interested in. But what happened quite by good fortune, really, was that this turned out to be, as I say, not by design, a very longitudinal study. So I interviewed 40 people in 1992, and then 20 years later, 15 of them again, and then just before the pandemic, at the 30th anniversary of the fall of the wall, 6 more. And so what I'm going to talk to you about, hopefully quite briefly today, was really what happens to this, as the final point here, meaning making and political engagement over time. How do people actually see the lives that they have lived? And what happens to this identity that they have as they look back over it? Do they still identify themselves as political beings, etc.? And what I want to tell you about, first of all, it's going to be really in 3 short bits. And the first bit is really focuses on the first question which I asked them. So what I did when I re-interviewed people for the first time in 20 years was I sent them their original transcripts and tapes from 1992, before we met. And they had a chance to read them and listen to them. And we began by talking about their experiences of hearing themselves 20 years before. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Then I'm going to talk about how at the present moment, when I was then interviewing them later, how they saw their political identity changing, in a way transforming, but also remaining constant in the decades which had passed. And then finally, with a look to how do they view that critical moment of 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell, which was not surprisingly quite a critical moment in not only the development of the country, but indeed in their own personal lives. So let's start with the first of these. This question, what was your experience like when you listened to your own voice, and when you listened to, was really much, much more provocative than I had anticipated. I knew it would be interesting. It was also that way for me. I too was 20 years older. My wonderful translator, Birgit Schmidt, we were the same team as we had been, and now everybody was 20 years older. So this was already implicitly quite an interesting thing. And again, to say not really explicitly about aging, but about fluidity through the life course, right? Us thinking at that moment back on another moment. So Ruth Reinecke, who is an actress with the Maxim Gorky Theater, she was very, very articulate speaker. And she says, I listened to myself as Ruth new and strange at the same time, but also, well, I'm not that much different from the person I was before, but I've gathered much more experience. So this idea of movement, but I love this phrase, Ruth new and strange at the same time. but I'm the same person. And this is really a theme which follows a lot. This speaker, André Brie, he was a leader in the Communist Party, actually, but of the more progressive branch. And he says here, I couldn't really remember having given such a long, differentiated interview. I was surprised in many ways. I found a lot of strands in my thought, in my convictions, my experience that continue to this day. So in a sense, there's this sense of almost befriending this earlier self. Also, that a lot of critical and positive things I said about the reunification process still ring true. I was also surprised because the last 20 years were a very intense time for me. Radical changes, transitional periods, being forced to scrutinize my own thinking, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a strong sense of continuity. What's interesting about this passage, and I've written quite a lot on this before, is how often he uses this word surprised. And he's really surprised to see this continuity. And I think, again, this rings back to the Ashton's opening talk, this idea that we're kind of ingrained with this idea of life stages somehow being impermeable. What he's surprised about is that he recognizes himself. There is indeed a deep continuity over time. Annette Simon, who is, she's a very well-known psychoanalyst, and her mother, since we're talking about literature a lot, her mother actually was the East German novelist Christa Wolf. And Annette Simon, again, says, I was very surprised at how clear I was already back then. That surprised me. You hear this theme of surprise. I thought I would have been much more confused. Third time, I was surprised how clearly I saw things already. And it became apparent to me how much has changed over the past 20 years. So it's not like everything has stayed the same. It's continuity and change, interweaving in one life over time. Because I always thought, well, not that much has changed, but that's not true. Really, very much has changed in my life. So it's neither one nor the other. It's a really complex interweaving over time. And I'm not going to read all of these out loud to you, but just to say that there is this kind of continuity, if you will, of recognition of the self. Nonetheless, there is change, okay? And how surprised people are. So one of the themes that we came back to time and again was about their political activism 20 years later. Now, again, just to remind you that the people who I was speaking with were for the most part leaders in this peaceful revolution. Very, very, very much people on the front lines. So what happens to their activism 20 years later, or indeed 30 years later, which is the last time I spoke to them? Now, again, here is Ruth Reinecke, again, the person who said I was both new and strange to myself. And she says, well, the most difficult challenge for me is in my profession. Well, I'm getting older. Again, she's an actress. She's a leading actress in Germany, actually. And my profession's always connected with biographical development, since we live in a world where many times it's about younger lives, and my profession is that you're a mirror. But now we are the age of 50, myself, older actually, she is. My sorrow is now, it is difficult to provide a mirror for the next generation. The focus is on young people. And then she goes on to tell me that she decides to actually do a play on aging, okay? And she reads Simone de Beauvoir's Old Age. And she says to me, it's like a detective novel. I'm so immersed in this. And now I realize that I have this role as a mentor to make this a very, engaging thing, also not just for the audience, but also for younger actors. Another example, a very important leading activist, Irene Kukutz, who had been very much on the front lines, okay? She talks to me here how, she says, well, politics are back in everyday life. I'm a confident citizen, still taking part in elections, but she doesn't actually feel that she needs to do it in terms of being at political protests. She had also lost her son, which is a really tragic part of her biography. And she says, you know, I see my political work more in the things I do here, and that is in her more intimate space rather than where she used to be. I'm not going to actually go through these because this is quite a bit longer, but again, more examples like this. And people, this is a set designer saying, well, yeah, I mean, 1989 was really important because they were able to travel much more. And so this was a theater troupe, etc. And this was important, but the ideas themselves did not so radically change. I'm just aware of the time, so I'm going to jump us through this. And to tell you, so this is one of my favorite, I think, quite illuminating quotes here. This is with Reinhard Weissun, again, one of the people I've stayed in touch with over the 30 years. So I say, well, if you compare, and he was actually the foreign minister for the Green Party in East Germany. He had been an architect before 1989. And he was one of the founding members of the Initiative for Peace and Human Rights. So I say to him, if you compare your political priorities, orientation, political activism now to when we last met, what's changed? What's the same? And he says, and this is really interesting, he says, well, the task is the same, only the situation has changed. So I say, well, so what is your task? And he says, to encourage democracy and emancipation. My situation is different. I mean, absolutely, he's a big public figure by the time we're talking at this point, because I'm no longer someone who needs help with that. Instead, I'm someone who can help others. Again, intergenerational mentoring, absolutely key and woven throughout our conversations. I used to need help. I'm now someone who can help. But my task, my goal on enhancing democracy, emancipation, that's still there. So moving towards the end now, there are some theories of political activism which really say, you know, that the critical moments happen in youth, etc. And I have for a long time argued against this, but I would say that in this particular research, that 1989 really did pose a very particular moment of promise and change. I say here, quoting Trevor Huddleston, who was part of my original study that I opened by telling you about. Trevor Huddleston says, there's always a honeymoon period in life when you fall in love with the job that's really worth your life. Nothing can take the place of that period. That is the moment, and ought to be, and is. And first of all, I think that's a very deeply moving way of describing that critical linchpin upon which a life is built. And indeed, it resonates with what my East German participants have been telling me now over 30 years. And I'm just going to give you a brief example of that before closing. So Ulrike Poppe, she is a very big public figure now. I mean, anyway, and works in the government, helping to rehabilitate former people who formerly worked for the Stasi, for the secret police. Anyway, but and here she is looking very, let's say, very mature, as opposed to, like, she's by her books and everything. And usually you'll see pictures of her which are very much, you know, out demonstrating. And she says here, that time will always be very special, even the most important time in my life. You can include 1988, 89, 90, maybe 91. Those were the years when everything changed, not just in Germany, but also in my thinking. Everything changed very rapidly. I had no precise idea of what we could expect, but I knew exactly what I no longer wanted. And Sebastian Flugbeil, this relates to a sort of more complicated story, which is that these activists who I interviewed were absolutely brokenhearted when the wall opened in the way it did on November the 9th, 1989, because all of their dreams of building a socialist, a East Germany, were pretty much shattered. And he says to me here, and he always returns to this theme. He's somebody I very much still know. And he says to me, well, we had the dream. And in a few, which is the title, as you know, of my talk here today, we had the dream, and in a few weeks in autumn '89, the feeling that as a normal citizen, we could discuss and influence the problems of society. It was a clear-cut part of the population that acted as if it were possible. And again, here, I want to highlight the importance of imagination, okay? The idea that that life can be other than what immediately confronts us. For almost every aspect of life, there were discussion groups, even in the villages, where the people got together and thought about what they could do. That was the most interesting time in my life, those 2 months. That stopped suddenly on the 9th of November, when the Berlin Wall opened. And finally, Irena Kukutz, this is a picture of her, obviously, in her youth. She says, and I want to say actually about the pictures, I commissioned a photographer to take pictures of people in 2014. And then we went back to the archives from the late 1980s and selected earlier pictures of them, and I've done a lot of visual work looking at these pictures and what people chose and how they, anyway, so this is one of those photographs. She says, I've learned so much from these women who she was working with in the prison, okay, after the changes of 1989, because during that time when we were politically active, we never asked where we came from or why we did certain things. We just acted. And it was great to see that for all those women who were incarcerated, who she was working with, and for myself, that this was the most important time in our lives until today. Okay, this, again, looking back at this critical juncture of 1989. And finally, I would like to finish with a quote, which for me encapsulates a lot of what I've been trying to say, by the scholar Jill Bradbury, who I believe is with us today. And Jill writes very, very powerfully about the importance of, well, as you see here, the past and the future. She says, perhaps nostalgia is not so much a longing for the way things were as a longing for futures that never came, or horizons of possibilities that have been foreclosed by the unfolding of events. Perhaps nostalgia is the desire not to be who we once were, but to be once again our potential future selves. And for me, that absolutely brilliantly encapsulates this fluidity of movement and of identity over time, where people are not only becoming different selves, but are revisiting the selves they once were or once thought they could be. And that is all I would like to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Molly. That was wonderful. And I love these common themes of imagination in creating selves, and looking at past selves and potential future selves, and also the theme of intergenerational mentoring, which has come up as well. So thank you for that. I'm going to move on now and introduce our next speaker. So Dr. Mary McGill, who is a digital culture researcher and journalist, former broadcaster. Mary is a regular media contributor in Ireland and the UK. From 2015 to 2020, she was a Hardiman Scholar at the National University of Ireland, Galway, where her doctoral study explored gender surveillance and selfie practices. Mary's book, The Visibility Trap, Sexism, Surveillance and Social Media, was published last year by New Island Books. And her talk today is titled Aging, Identity and Instagram, Exploring Silver Influencers and #Nanacore. So thanks, Mary, and I'll hand over to you. I think you are, yes, you're starting your screen share, thanks. can't actually hear you though.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Great.
yes, we can.
Good.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you.
Here we go. Here we go. So good afternoon, everyone. I am quite intimidated to have to follow all of those fantastic speakers, but we'll give it a go. And thank you very much. It's an absolute delight to be here with you this afternoon. This is a very, very brief exploration of silver influencers, so-called silver influencers, and so-called Nana core. And the title of the talk is Aging Identity. And I think in Instagram, I can't quite see the slide there. Anyway, we'll move on. And so I'm just going to try and bring this down. Okay, great. And so let me see, so I can see. There we go. And so I think to begin, it's important to point out, I'm going to be talking a lot about representation in popular culture and the media in this talk. And I think it's important to point out that when we're talking about representation, there are positives and there are negatives. The idea of representation is always a very complex and knotty one. And so I wanted to begin with this quote from Léime in 2015, looking at representation and aging in the media. And they say, in the 21st century, the visibility of older people and their positive portrayal in the media, including advertising, have arguably increased. But media and advertising depictions about aging and older age continue to be somewhat limited. In particular, what might be considered positive portrayals can turn out to be more ambiguous in their constructions of older age than might at first appear to be the case. And so that idea, I think, of ambiguity and complexity is an important one to keep in mind when we're looking at, what may be construed initially as positive or progressive representations of aging, and in some respects certainly are, but when we dig into them and we think about them critically, what else might be going on there, and how might that what else be limiting in certain contexts? Another important piece of representation or theory about representation as well in the media is the work of Gifsoff and Peterson from 2008. And they write that in regard to the aging body, media technology shape the everyday life of older people, and media representations both reify and challenge notions of the aging body and the space it inhabits in modern society. Ageism is visible in many aspects of popular culture, and that's not a surprise to any of us who are speaking or participating here today, I'm sure. They say from the emphasis on youth in the fashion industry to practices of representation in television and movies, and the absence of representation of older people and their life experiences. At the same time, anti-ageism appears to be gaining an increasingly firm grip in media representations, helped along by changes in media distribution and third age consumerism. And it's interesting to think about, we don't have time to talk about it today, but how the rise of things like streaming platforms, of fragmentations of audiences, more niche programming has actually opened up different types of markets which has contributed to a greater diversity of representation in the media. And of course, third age consumerism, the spending power of some categories of older people, and how this in turn contributes to certain types of representations becoming more popular. So in this complex media landscape then, quote, despite seeing more positive and nuanced representations of aging people, this positivity or focus on the active older body becomes constrictive in itself. So, as we heard earlier on, we may be seeing more representations of aging, but what are those representations of aging saying about what it is to age, or what aging should be? And those are very important questions to keep in mind when we're looking at what it is we think we're seeing represented in the media. And of course, to keep in mind about what we are not seeing represented in the media when it comes to aging. And so what we touched on this earlier on as well, one thing that persists, whether we were talking about traditional types of media, such as print media, television media, radio media, and that has also found sadly, purchase online, is the gendered double standard when it comes to aging. And Christy Fairclough, in writing about the treatment of female celebrities online and research around representation and aging in celebrity culture, she writes that popular culture is able to accept and even celebrate an aging man, but quite the opposite is the case in relation to women. It is not new to suggest that aging, as represented in popular culture, is linked to a range of negative meanings associated with decay and invisibility. In popular culture, the older female body is particularly vilified. And as I said, this kind of vilification persists online. And I think this is a critical point, because quite often when we talk about representation online, particularly when it comes to, you know, the feminist movement and various other social justice movements, there can be a kind of an assumption that representation online is an inherently progressive act. And indeed it can be, but it also comes up against quite restrictive and regressive cultural norms that actually have been kind of, in certain respects, given fresh power and fresh purpose, fresh purchase, and a new ability to circulate as never before because of how online platforms are designed. So this double standard persists online. We see it in the treatment of, we'll say, a very high profile and very powerful woman in the popular consciousness, the pop star Madonna, who has been the victim of a lot of kind of online abuse, because she's a very active Instagram user. She engages with fans on there. She still portrays herself sexually. She still creates music. So she is not retreating from the stage. And this has given rise to the term old Donna, which is a form of abuse which is levelled at her, often through social media platforms. An Urban Dictionary defines old Donna, or says it refers to Madonna because she is, and these are their words, certainly not mine, because she is old and not relevant in pop music industry anymore. And as Gordon and Garde Hansen say in their work, exploring how Madonna, her performance is denigrated online, they point out that online culture consumes, produces, and regurgitates. Hi, I think it was muted there.
Sorry, Mary,
Mary.
I did that by
Mary, we can hear you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's no problem at all. That's no problem. Go back to talking about Madonna. I could talk about Madonna all day. Sadly, this is not a very positive account of what's happening to Madonna online. But in their research, looking at the treatment, this kind of very gendered, very ageist treatment of Madonna online, Gordon and Garde Hansen say online culture consumes, produces, and regurgitates images of aging femininity with cruel alacrity, and Madonna's aging body and its performances are fueling the viral circulation of textual and visual languages about older women, running the gamut from regal to revolting references. So the idea of being a queen or a dowager justess, this type of visibility that's always been offered to older women in certain types of roles, to revolting references, the stereotypical crone, the witch, the old Donna, as it were. Let's move on here. Sorry, my slides seem to be frozen. There we go. And so that brings us, make sure I didn't skip anything. No. So that brings us on then to the rise of the so-called silver influencer phenomenon. And this has been picked up in the popular press over the last year or so. So if we look at Vogue from December 2021, we have a headline here that says the rise of nanocore Instagram. Insta's silver influencers are keeping things fresh. Okay, so, and that keeping things fresh is really, I think, instructive, because when we're looking at a platform like Instagram, it is all about the fresh, it is all about the novel, it is all about processes of commodification as much as it is about processes of self-representation, self-narration, and self-expression. Okay, so those two things on a platform like Instagram are very closely related. If we go to the Irish Independent, October 2021, we see the rise of silver influencers, and a quote that accompanies that headline: "Our mothers had to conform to twin sets and pearls, but we are allowed to express our personalities." And when we look at the construction of the silver influencer, we do get this kind of a notion of a kind of pushing back against traditional ideas of aging, and this notion of freedom expressed through these platforms that allow women to claim visibility in a way that just would not have been conceivable in older forms of technology and broadcasting. And so on that point then, social media like Instagram are part of what are known as participatory technologies. So all form of media in a very basic sense broadcasted to audiences. With the rise of digital media, audiences are not simply broadcasted to anymore, they're also broadcasting themselves. They no longer simply consume content, they also create content. So that relationship has been changed utterly. And it's given rise to platforms like Instagram, which is one of the biggest photo sharing apps on the planet. I think it has 1 billion users currently. It allows its users to create visual artifacts, videos, photographs, and share them with their followers. And these videos and photographs are usually contextualized through the use of text. And so users can contribute and follow conversations using hashtags, which the Oxford English Dictionary conveniently or helpfully defines as a word or phrase preceded by a hash sign used on social media websites and applications, especially Twitter, but also Instagram, to identify digital content on a specific topic. Now, influencers and Instagram are commonly associated in the popular consciousness. And often when we think of Instagram or Instagram influencers, we think of young women, we may think of the family Kardashians, we associate them with the types of selfies that involve, looking very youthful, often very slim, stereotypical kind of beauty practices taken in glamorous surrounds, a real emphasis on wellness, lifestyle, and travel, all of these things. And Crystal Abaddon conveniently defines the influencer as follows. They're typically young women, although not always, who accumulate a relatively large following on blogs and social media through the textual and visual narration of their personal lives and lifestyles, engage with their following in digital and physical spaces, and monetize their following by integrating advertorials into their blog or social media posts. And so in a very basic sense then, what the silver influencer phenomenon and terminology refers to is women who are regarded as embodying these characteristic attributes of the influencer, with one key difference: they're older, okay? So here we have an example of an Irish silver influencer who's been covered in the press. Her name is Over the Hilda. So you can see her image here. This is taken from her Instagram page. And Hilda, I believe she's in her 60s. She's got over 7,000 followers on Instagram. And if we look at the hashtags that she's using hashtag over 60 blogger, hashtag staying stylish, hashtag wear what you like, mature style, ageless style, say stay strong. So if traditional notions of aging have tended to follow the trajectory that women should vacate the stage, as it were, Over the Hilda, with her popularity and her taking up space on Instagram and poking fun at the notion of over the hill, is rejecting that entirely. She's also building a community through the use of hashtags, because there are responses here to her post, and she in turn responds to her followers. So this representation, as much as it is about Hilda, it's also about audiences and network building and community making. And so, this is from an interview that Hilda gave to the Irish Independent. The piece says, Hilda, 64, a retired English teacher from Malahide, was also inspired to join the platform after a conversation with her daughter, stylist Courtney Smith. And she says, I think it was 2016, and she said to her daughter, there are no bloggers for older women. It's absolutely ridiculous. And she said, oh, well, you should start a blog, Mum. And I said, maybe I will. And off she went, and she did it. And her family eventually got on board, and the rest, as I say, is history. In this image from Hilda, again, she's all dressed up. She's talking about dressing up as part of a group activity that she's enjoying with other bloggers. And it's focused on Iris Apfel, who has become kind of was a fashion icon, has become even more so after a Netflix documentary about her, brought her to a whole new audience. Iris is, I think she's got over 2 million followers on Instagram. She's 100 years old, and she's probably the silver influencer, par excellence, the most visible person representing this trend. But here we can see how Hilda is drawing inspiration from that and creating community around that. And the hashtags here, some of them style, not age, and so on. So it's about, again, obviously notions of consumption, but also notions of pleasure and community building and visibility, which is absolutely key to these accounts. Here we have Eileen Style Queen. Eileen is in her 80s. She's from Dublin, I believe, and she's over 55,000 followers on Instagram. And again, we can see, this kind of focus on fashion and lifestyle, but also a kind of a very active style of aging. Eileen is she travels a lot. She goes out a lot. She likes to shop, and this is very much part of the self brand that she has built for herself as a so-called silver influencer on Instagram. And again, quote here from the Irish Independent, where she talks about, I'm not big into talking about, what she does with her friends, she says, but I have she has some friends who are very interested in what she does, but she does say that she's aware that some of them would be like, well, what in the name of God are you doing at your age? Okay, with this kind of activity on Instagram. But clearly she is connecting 55,000 followers, over 55,000 followers. She's building a community of people who are clearly really, really hungry for this type of content. And as we know, that diverse types of representations of aging being treated as something that is normal and commonplace and mainstream rather than a special issue, that type of content can still be very absent in the mainstream. So it's interesting to think about why it is Eileen and Hilda are having the impact that they clearly are, and Eileen also follows kind of the traditional, influencer style of self-representation. So as we see here in this quote from the Irish Independent, she says, as well, or the journalist writes, as well as sharing her outfits and sponsored posts about hotel stays and meals out, Eileen says her followers like to hear about when she meets up with friends for lunch, lunch dates or bridge parties. It's about more than the clothes, she says. People want to know what your lifestyle is and what you're doing. So again, that notion of community and even intimacy in a way, kind of parasocial ideas of the relationship that these influencers have between themselves and their followers. And here we have Eileen here again, and this is a classic influencer pose. It's the mirror selfie, and the mirror selfie allows you to take an image where you can see your background and the clothes that you're wearing. So this is for classic influencer behavior. And so just to close then to say, a kind of a very positive assessment of what's going on in this very brief exploration of the silver influencer phenomenon. In a very basic sense, using Instagram to claim visibility. Aging is often associated with invisibility in many respects, particularly when it comes to representation in the media. So these tools of self-representation that allow people to broadcast and document their lives as never before provide women with a real ability to speak back to and to claim space, claim visibility for themselves in a way that would have been unimaginable just 10 years ago. There's real humor to the content as well, and a willingness to use self-representation to challenge traditional ideas of aging. And it showcases a very active vision of aging. There's a real emphasis on community and family, consumerism and pleasure, and of course style in these accounts. The creating digital identities that embrace rather than allied aging. So these hashtags, the self-narration, it is not hiding from aging, it's actually making aging the center of the brand or the self-representation, which is quite interesting. And the popularity of these accounts indicates or suggests that these influencers are connecting with other women. And I think that's a really interesting point. And I hope that that's looked into further, the nature of the community building and the exchanges that are happening in these spaces. And hashtags such as over 60 blogger enable older Instagram users to connect with one another without the constraints of the physical world. And I think that's important too, because sometimes it can be a struggle to find that community. So they connect with each other through a shared, conception of aging as a positive site of commonality and community. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much for this, Mary. That was a really rich talk, and all of the talks that we've heard so far really illuminated the topic from completely different angles, and yet they all also come together, I feel, very nicely. And we are a little bit, we've run a little bit over time, but we will now continue straight away with our final talk, or really we call it a conversation, by perhaps, I don't know, Mary, can you unshare your screen?
Yes, I'm trying to.
Okay.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Mary.
No problem.
Because we will move on to the final speaker of this first part of the panel, and that is Helen O'Reilly. And in doing so, we will actually stay with social media quite a bit, namely with a Twitter platform. Just waiting to see if Maggie, can you spotlight perhaps Helen and?
Yeah, I'm just looking for Helen now. Helen,
and
if you
while you're doing that,
hello, I'm here. Hello. No, that's not me.
I'm just looking for you there. Sorry.
While Maggie's doing that, I can.
Oh, I've got you, Helen.
Yeah,
I found you, I think.
Hi, Helen.
Hiya.
So I will just very briefly introduce Helen. For Twitter users, it's probably absolutely unnecessary to introduce you. So Helen O'Reilly is an Irish television producer and executive who has worked for the BBC and RTE, among others. After 30 years in London, Helen, you returned to Dublin in 2019, I believe, to stay with your 90-year-old aunt, Monica. I don't know if she probably wasn't 90 years old then, but you stayed with your aunt Monica, and you also cared for her throughout the pandemic. And many of us, I'm sure, enjoyed the tweets that Helen posted during this time, using the hashtag #TheStairliftAscends, about her relationship with her aunt during lockdowns, during the COVID-19 pandemic. I have a personal favorite tweet that is about her aunt calling loudly from the sitting room, Helen, can you help me? And Helen dropping everything, rushing to the front room, expecting her to have fallen, and the aunt saying, the cat's on my lap, could you pour me a small Jameson? So that is one of my personal favorites. These tweets have been collected in a book, The Stairlift Ascends, Tweets from a COVID Cocoon. Very good, because I forgot to bring my copy. It's good that you brought yours, Helen. That was published with O'Brien's books, and it was described by Marion Keyes as fabulously funny, humane, and heartwarming. And we're so glad that Helen has agreed to talk to us about the tweets about her Aunt Monica, about being a carer during the COVID-19 pandemic. And yes, perhaps you can just start out saying how all of this came about, what it was like to actually come back to Ireland, to move in with your aunt, and then the pandemic happening.
Hello, everybody. I feel like the Prof, after all these esteemed academics. So this is very much a non-scripted, just chat. So if you all disappear off screen to make your coffees and teas, that's fine too. 2019 was, as the Queen said about one of her years, an annus horribilis for me, through a multitude of ghastly events, including, well, Brexit didn't help. And then a relationship of 19 years broke down, so the London house had to be sold. My mother's Alzheimer's was getting worse, and she lived with my aunt up not far from me here in Dublin, 20 minutes north in the seaside town of Rush. My mother was 91, my aunt was 89, and they had been looking after each other for years and years after the death of my father. And so with the cataclysm in my life in London, I decided time to wrap up things in London, come back and actually give up, a 6-figure job. And I'd worked in television for 30 years. And I was the first woman director of television in RTE, and in between various stints at the BBC. So I came back to be a carer. I gave it everything up, and I sold the house, and obviously would be trying to buy a house here in Dublin, which I did finally. And I moved in, and sadly, my mother died very shortly after I came back, but I was here for her last few weeks. So then here was me and this wonderful woman. Now, I haven't got the technology to, this is my Aunt Monica in 1967, descending the steps from one of her planes. She was a single woman all her life. She was a pharmaceutical assistant and a beautician, and she loved holidays, and she was incredibly independent, incredibly feisty. And here was her niece coming back to live with her in the family home. She wasn't happy. And I thought she'd be thinking, oh, at last, somewhere, you know, she's going to look after me and so forth. So that was the start of an incredible, I think it was 15 months, most of which I was living with her. And after the few months, once the pandemic started, we were literally in the house all the time because there was very few things, as you know, we could do. And it revealed to me this now 90-year-old woman who had had a very quiet life, a very invisible life, never been in the papers, never been on television, always in the shadow of my mother, who was a very theatrical artist and writer, and you know, at 70 and 80 would be going to Ardgillan Castle for writing and painting lectures and so forth. My aunt was very quiet, always in her shadow. And she revealed herself to me by living, as we were living cheek by jowl. And she became revealing to me about myself and how I had had a wonderful but egotistical time in working in television. As a carer, I had to turn into literally washing her and cleaning her and doing all the things carers do, and looking after, let alone her health, her food, her intake, all those things, and taking her out when I could to her favorite department stores for her lovely milky coffee. And I have to say, and I said this to the organisers, that in those short few months that I had with my 91-year-old aunt, I learned more about myself than I had done in the previous 56 years. And it's made me a better person. And I don't mean to sound, you know, twee about this. Seeing that her frailties were one thing. Obviously, as you get older, the frailties are there. But the mind was sharp, and the mind was funny and cutting and feisty. And that's why, because I have a social media profile on Twitter where I've got 3,000 followers. So I started to tweet out these little interactions we had during lockdown. I mean, at night I would sit at my computer, and why I called it the stairlift ascends is because there was a stairlift in the house that my mother used to use, and the aunt refused to use it because she said she was too young. So eventually, when she decided she would use it, she would wait every night until she was going up, and it would make a sound like R2-D2 as she set off up the stairs. And she would save the best till last, and she would save the next day's tasks for me and yell down the stairs at what I had to do the next day. So that's why I called it the stairlift ascends, because I would sit down, calm, have my glass of wine, and then the beeps would go and the stairlift ascend, and I'd go like this. And the next day's tasks were there, shouted at me down the stairs. So with her permission, I want to be clear about this, because a lot of people have said, did your aunt know you were going to do this? I hadn't a plan for a book. I was just tweeting out our chats and or what we did that day. She'd always have a funny, this is before it even became a book now. My aunt said, I hear it's a bank holiday tomorrow. Me, it is. Aunt, I hate them. Me, I know. Aunt, everyone goes out and your mother and I never went anywhere. Me, so you've told me. And it's awful. Me, well, nobody's going anywhere now. And she said, oh, yes, good. So that was the lockdown, you know. And she'd always have a pithy line or a witty throwaway, something. And it was actually, these tweets are not about taking the piss out of her. In fact, more they're taking the piss out of me, because we went to Arnott's together, and there's one in here where she says, did you get anything? And I said, oh yeah, I got a few pair of sloggy knickers. And she goes, I didn't know they made them in your size. I mean, you know, who else is going to say that to you other than a mother or an aunt? So anyway, these were wonderful, and they were pulled together by brilliant Ivan O'Brien about 4 weeks before Christmas 2020. And Marion Keyes gave me the lovely thing on the front. And with my aunt's permission, she knew, and she saw the draft and everything and loved it. And we were one of the top 10 sellers at Christmas 2020. And the best part of it was that at Christmas 2020, I had bought this house here in Dublin, central Dublin, and my aunt was here for Christmas, and it was to be her last Christmas, sadly. And but the post via O'Brien Press had letters from around the world, from Singapore, Australia, San Francisco, you name it. They came in saying, you know, letters to my aunt, letters to me, via the publisher, saying thank you for allowing, you know, the voices of this wonderful 90-year-old woman nobody knows. And in fact, in the book, her name Monica is not mentioned because she didn't want her name mentioned. And then when we had the first review of it in the Irish Times, and before the Irish Times was published, a photographer came to take a photograph of my aunt and me on the stairs with a stair lift. And my aunt said, "Is my name in this article?" And I said, "Well, you said you didn't want your name." She said, ring the journalist up, tell her my name is Monica. So the name went in, so that was fine. And so Monica was surrounded at her last Christmas, as it turned out to be, with piles of letters from around the world and little gifts in them and everything. And she felt like she was on top of the world. And she said, "But I've never made a fuss about anything. I've never wanted this, or I've never wanted." And I thought, well, you know, there are these wonderful invisible women who surround us. You know, we're mouthy, we're on platforms, we talk, we're academics, we get to conferences and so forth. And these, as I call my mum and my aunt, my pillars of the house. These were my pillars of the house. And in some way I'm getting a bit emotional now, actually. I just wanted them to be there on the map. And I am so delighted. Sadly, Monica died 3 months later, thankfully not from COVID, but you know, and it broke my heart, and I miss her every day. I miss her going around supermarkets, and I miss her going around Arnott's department store with her, looking for something to wear and looking for her cappuccino. But I'm so glad I wrote. I mean, this isn't a novel. This isn't fiction. This is just a collection using my skills at social media and using O'Brien Press and getting an invisible woman around the world. And I thought that's a great testament to not only Irish women, but women of every age, because this 90-year-old held me to account.
Thanks so much for this, Helen. That's, yeah, it's really moving. I mean, I followed, lots of comments now in the chat. I followed this more or less from the start. I remember seeing your tweets and then following you and thinking, wow, this is such a counterbalance to the images we usually get, especially at the start of the pandemic, when everyone was going like, okay, old people have to be cocooned. Once you are over a certain age, you can just lock yourself inside and not be seen, and you'll be safe, but you won't be missed because you don't contribute a lot. So that was the general tenor. And then there was also the idea of, all those images that accompanied newspaper articles and so on about the pandemic. And very often these images are just body parts of older people, like the wrinkly hands. And there was even this hashtag saying no more wrinkly hands, because really it's very dehumanizing to just assume that you can define someone basically just by way of the way their skin looks, or the sense, the idea of frailty this conveys. And then really, as you said, to give a voice and a space and a name to an actual 90-year-old woman who has to cocoon and who has to stay inside. I found that very, very important. And I mean, your followers confirm this quite obviously. So
they're hijacking it now, I see.
Yeah, they do. Okay. So perhaps just a final question on my part. What was it like for you? I mean, I think for your aunt, it was probably, at least, I mean, I can imagine she was very, there was also one tweet that you included where she said, that's been the worst year of my life because she couldn't go anywhere. But on the other hand, she had that moment of recognition and fame and excitement. What was it like for you to be a carer? Did you feel supported enough? Did you feel was it?
Not really. No. I mean, I have one brother, but he's lived in Cambridge in the UK for pretty much all his adult life. I mean, he was very helpful financially and so forth. But I mean, it was a whole brand new thing to me. I mean, I used to travel back quite a lot from London to Dublin to see them for weekends and things. And also I would take them away on holidays. We had, my mother and my aunt, we'd have great holidays in France or Spain or Italy. And they look forward to that every year. So they were well-traveled women. But caring for somebody once they, they need, I had the bathroom remodeled for them and so forth. And, I mean, an aunt's relationship with a niece is slightly different to a mother's relationship with a daughter. A mother might let her wash her in the shower and so forth. But we negotiated that, and that was fine. And, I would do her nails for her. I'd wash her back. I'd do all that. And it was intimate. And this woman is a woman of her generation where they're very, concerned about their, revealing themselves or so forth. So I had to learn how to, confront this and gently persuade and also negotiate all her medical care, because some women at that age don't want to go and see their doctors and all that type of thing. And I'm usually quite, in my work life, I was very, ready to go, and I just had to really train myself to pull back, not be telling her what to do, listening to her, learning very, very quickly how to negotiate. It wasn't like anything that I'd had to do at work. And to persuade, to gently persuade, and to calm things down. Because, she was tough, she was feisty, and good for her. She really, really, fought against the dying of the light. I mean, I really do think she did. Luckily, her mind was great. Her body was failing her slightly, and she was thin and so forth. And you kind of watch in, not despair, but you try and just keep them going as long as they understand, and you can get them out for a day trip. They've been just sitting in a car having a coffee. So it was the most profoundly wonderful period of my life, I have to say, doing that, caring for her and her teaching me. It wasn't just a one-way thing. I learned so much. I really did learn so much in that period. So in that way, it was, I mean, the pandemic wasn't great, but just being in her presence and talking, we talk politics. This is not, okay, women could, but, we'd watch prime time, we'd debate various things. And she was quite open-minded for a woman of her generation. So, sometimes we'd have little fights about things, but that was good. Her brain was ticking, and that's fine. But it was an extraordinary time with her, and I'm so glad I had it.
And that touches upon the whole idea or the importance of intergenerational exchange, doesn't it? Again, that Ashton also emphasized, and some of the other speakers, how important it is to actually have that kind of relationship, intergenerational relationships and dialogue, and to care for one another. Because I mean, it's not just that you cared for her during the pandemic, I assume, but you also got out a lot of that exchange with her, as you said, and rather than being isolated and locked away, as so many of us were during that time.
Yes.
So, and then, of course, also the social media community and everyone. I mean, I didn't see. I briefly scanned the chat. Didn't see any direct question now, but a lot of affirmative comments and people saying thanks for this, and I followed you, and you just put into words what I have experienced myself. So.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm not, in one way, there are so many carers who have it so much more difficult with, for example, children, who may have some severe disabilities and who can't get access to services. So I'm not painting caring as, a wonderful thing. It is so difficult. It is so, so you are responsible for an adult who may not have, may not be able to walk to. I mean, there's so much resting on you. But yet I can look back on it and think that was just as I said, it was a profoundly moving experience. It really was. I mean, she'd have me pulling my hair out sometimes, and I'd be shouting at her from the kitchen and she'd be shouting at me from the sitting room, So it was, the two of us are feisty, we come from the same genetics, Luckily my dad's line was calm, so I have a bit of that too. So, this was like, and the funny thing was when she sold her own house, when their father died, my grandfather, we built on an extension to our house in Glasnevin for my aunt to come and live with us when I was a teenager. So she was like she was just about in her 50s when I was about 15 or 16. And it was like having a second mother stroke sister for me, because I don't have a sister. And I used to go up to her extension. She was a great cook, fabulous cordon bleu cook, and brilliant pastry chef and all these type of things. And she had her own kitchen. And we watched Dallas every Tuesday night, and she'd have a fresh cake made. And the two of us would sit like sisters, or, watching Dallas and laughing loudly at, silly things in Dallas. And that would be my break from doing my homework, or, So we had an early bond way back when I was a teenager. And then I left for 30 years. And then I came back. So we had a kind of rock solid basis from years ago that we picked up on again. And that was lovely too.
Brilliant. And I think you brought everyone so much joy with this. And the thing, I just can't stress this enough, the fact that you not wrote about your aunt, but you really allowed her voice to go out into the world, because you just wrote down the dialogues as they happened. And I think that is so very important. It's really her voice that we hear, not someone writing about her, but really giving her the space to have her voice heard. And I'm just checking the chat now. Any insights from Ms. Nolan, any insights or observation from Helen on diminishing the blunt realities of helping to care for loved ones as their health declines? So that would be the final question for you before we go into a short break.
Blunt realities. Well, I mean, you can't get more blunt than having to lift somebody from a bed and to strip them and wash them and so forth. I mean, what we did was we hired private carers to come and who knew how to handle people towards the end of her life. I didn't know, I hadn't any professional training in anything like that. And I mean, thank God we had the luxury, we could afford to get private carers in, but the HSE carers also were trained in that. And even it's for a shower or so forth. And to get, all I would say is try and harness certainly HSE support. I know it's down to a few hours. My mum and aunt had 1 hour HSE carers which is, what can you do in an hour? So my brother and I had to obviously come in with cash and get private trained carers to do those physical things and medical things that I wouldn't be able to do. So it wasn't just me and I did the looking after, the noise in the night type of worry, the shopping, the cooking, the gardening, although she'd yell at me out the window because I always did the gardening wrong. And once it gets when illness and frailty are getting worse, you must try and get on the HSE or start planning, because you will need professional help. There is no doubt. I would not have been able to do it without professional help, and that's blunt realities, and some people just do not have the wherewithal to do that. And I've heard, because the thing is, I'd tweet some stories, and in my direct messages, I'd get confidential messages from a lot of my followers about the horrendous situation with their elderly parents. And I'd close the computer at night and could barely sleep with some of the stories that were told to me. So I think, I was way at the lucky end, put it that way.
So, and that also goes to show that there's only so much we can do on our own, that we also really need institutional help in some way, professional help.
I want to show you one thing. This is a bit of a, I didn't tell you this before we stop. Hang on. The one thing my aunt did do was come down to my house in Dublin and help me create this garden. So I thought I'd give you a look. And she designed this for me, and that's her legacy. And so every day I open the doors to that, and Monica's still with me. So I hope that's a nice ending to this.
That's so beautiful. Thanks so much. And for ending on that very, very positive note and beautiful note. Thanks so much, Helen.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks to all the speakers. And I'm really sorry. I mean, we had planned for discussion time, but we've run over a little bit. And I think we all need a short break. I mean, after slightly more than 2 hours, we probably all in need of a break. We had planned for some longer discussion time at the end of the second part. And we can also use this to address some of the questions that perhaps we have not now been able to address. So hopefully all of you will stay on for the second part, which is definitely absolutely worth it. We will keep our introduction to the project extremely short, and then we will give space for the participants of the creative writing workshop to voice their own, to express their own views on aging, and then we will have time for a final discussion. So I would say how much time do we need? Perhaps 5 minutes just to get a cup of coffee or tea. So we'll meet again 5 minutes before 4:30. Is that okay? 4:25.
Well, that gives everyone 7 minutes, so an extra
7 minutes.
2. That's perfect.
Hi everyone, welcome back. We're really excited about this second half of the webinar today, where we get to listen to the creative writing outputs from a creative writing workshop that is part of the ReStorying Aging project, and which was guided by Éilís na Dhuibhne. And we're going to keep our introductions very brief and pass over to the women who are going to read for you. But just to say a little bit about the project before we do that, the idea of it really was to provide a space for women to give voice to their own narratives, to write with age, I suppose is a way to put it, and narratives that we don't very often get the opportunity to hear in the culture around us, which is often so youth oriented. And so to really have an opportunity to listen to the wisdom and the experiences that come with age, and in that way to intervene in dominant discourses and narratives and stories about aging that, as we've learned from listening to the talks, are so often built on assumptions and on stereotype. And so I'll just pass over to Michaela now just to say a little bit more about the project.
Okay, thanks, Maggie. So basically, I'll keep this very short. We started this project with the idea in mind, as Maggie said, to give a space, a voice for older women to express their own life narratives, their own life stories, as a kind of counterbalance to popular media images that can very often be stereotypical and limiting. And the idea was to, on the one hand, discuss those media images with the women. And we did that. We looked at some media images, including short clips from Grace and Frankie, the Netflix series that many of you will be familiar with, but also things like the very controversial and perhaps infamous commercial from the Bank of Ireland. that many of you in Ireland will also know. So positive and negative ones. And then we also had a session on women's life writing, including poetry, but also prose. And this would be the type of writing that is very often not that well known, that is not as popular and not as prominent, but maybe that may have much to offer when it comes to restoring prevalent conceptions and cultural narratives of aging. And so that is what the creative writing course was then built on as well. And that creative writing course was led by Éilís ní Dhuibhne. We weren't really involved in that part of the project all that much, but perhaps I don't know if I didn't know if Karen is actually here, and if you also wanted to say a few words about your involvement with the project, yes, and then we would hand over to Karen.
Yeah, thanks, Michaela. For me, I was just going to say the project shows how meaningful collaboration can be, in creating these opportunities for flourishing, and how, it's been fantastic working on the project, and I'm grateful to the Moore Institute as well for hosting me as a visiting scholar. But I also think that the work that the women produced through the project demonstrates the power that stories can have on a personal as well as on a collective level. And, just the various examples we've seen of life writing today, from, different forms of social media to what we'll see now as poetry, letters, memoir, and, other forms of prose. So being mindful of time, I think we will press on and let the work speak for itself.
Yeah, and first of all, perhaps hand over to Éilís, who will say a few words about her experience of conducting the workshop, and then also introduce the participants. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I'd like to say thank you to Michaela and Maggie and Karen for inviting me to facilitate this workshop, and it has been a fantastic experience. And I have a lot to say about how the workshop worked and why it was so successful, and which it was. It was just a wonderful experience, and so much good writing came out of it. And I have lots of theories about why that happened. The main one was, of course, the personalities and the great people who were in it. But I'm going to leave all that until afterwards, because time is running on, which it always did during our workshops as well. And I think we just get straight to the writing and the reading now. And if there's time to talk about it after that, that would be just fantastic. So I'm going to introduce the readers from the workshop by name, and I'm going to ask each person, each of our writers, to just say a little tiny bit about themselves by way of introduction. So today our readers are going to be Rose O'Driscoll, who's going to read Driving to Mass, Caroline Moran Griesbach, who will read When I Am Old, Meadhbh Bhrádaigh, who will read I Am Amazed. I should say at this point that these titles, I Am Amazed and When I'm Old, are quotes from other writers. I Am Amazed is from a bit by Alice Munro. When I'm Old is, the When I'm Old I wear purple, and so on, which kind of were the prompts for these pieces. Pauline Dolan, Letter to Nuala O'Faolán. Mary Rafferty, who will read Attunement and I think maybe another poem. Meadhbh Bhrádaigh is going to read another piece called Context of a Lifetime. Then Teresa Mason can't be with us today, and I'm going to read her Letter to Myself, aged 20. Kathryn Daly is going to read a poem called Funny How Grief. And Maeve again is going to read If You Didn't Know What Age You Were. And then I will read a piece by somebody else who can't be with us today, Patricia Cronin, and I'm probably going to wish all the pieces were so fantastic. I think I'll read a little piece from her I Am Amazed and from her Letter to Myself, age 20. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Rose. I hope Rose is there somewhere.
I'm here, Éilís, yeah. Can you hear me?
Good. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So, thanks to Éilís for the introduction, and welcome again to everybody for the stories, and I'm delighted to be here. My name is Rose O'Driscoll, as Éilís said, and this is, I've just recently returned back to Ireland from the United Kingdom, having spent a long time away, back to West Cork in Southern Ireland. So that's where I'm talking to you this afternoon from. So my story is driving to Mass. It was a very wet Sunday, and Sunday in our house was solely centered on attending Mass. Nothing else mattered. Normally, my father drove us to Mass, but on this particular Sunday, my father was very ill with the flu, and that was the most unusual occurrence, as my father was rarely, if ever, ill. My father was the only one with a driving license in our home. My mother did not drive. Two of my siblings and I could drive, but we were all under the age of 12, hence we had no licenses. Despite this predicament, my mother could not comprehend us not attending Sunday Mass. To do so would have made her the talk of the parish for the week, and that was never going to be allowed to happen. My mother was a woman who lived her life keeping up appearances, and in a small rural community, that was paramount to your very existence. Throughout my childhood, I felt my mother's actions and behaviors veered between pride and arrogance. But of course, she would certainly not say that to her face. Anyhow, on that Sunday, and despite my father's advice to remain at home, my mother rounded up all 7 of us children. She told me I was going to be the driver that Sunday. I was 12 years old, but I had been driving since I was 9. However, most of my driving up to that Sunday had been on back roads and country lanes. This would be my first journey driving on public main roads. It was also my first time driving with a car full of people. My usual journeys were with a couple of my sisters, never with my brothers, as they were always highly critical of my driving. Our car, a very bright blue Austin A40, registration number YZA282, had a hatchback. So, with my mother in the passenger seat, 4 of my siblings in the back seat, and 2 more in the boot hatch, we headed off to the local church, which was 2 miles away. 1 mile of which was on the main Skibbereen to Bantry Road. A very busy road at all times, but especially so on a Sunday before midday Mass. The plan was to drive to the outskirts of the village, park in the local garage yard, and walk through the village to the church. Despite the heavy rain and knowing we were going to get very wet, this was preferable to non-attendance at Mass. The whole plan worked a treat. With the car safely parked in the forecourt of the garage, facing outwards, ready for the return home, we made our way to Mass. I don't remember the Mass or anything about it. I spent most of the hour and a half that Mass took being amazed and delighted that I had managed to accomplish the task of driving us to Mass. That was such a great thing to happen to me. That day, as a 12-year-old child, I felt I had finally come of age. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rose. That's such a fantastic story. I just love it. And you read it so beautifully. Thank you. So now we're going to hear from Caroline, Moran, When I Am Old.
Hi. Hi, everyone. You'll see me now in a minute. Yeah, can you see me now? So I live in Applewhite in the west of Ireland. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, we can hear you.
And you can see me. Is everything okay? Oh, there you go. Yeah?
Thanks, Caroline. It just took me a second to find you there.
So, hello, everyone. My name is Caroline, and I live in Athenry in the west of Ireland. And despite my feminist leanings, I've led a very traditional female life. I've stayed at home, gave up paid work 16 years ago, and I've raised my 4 children, and that's where I'm at the moment. So the piece that I wrote has been inspired by the poet Jenny Joseph, her poem Warning, which starts with the line, "When I am an old woman, I shall wear purple." I first came across this poem a long time ago and loved it. What appealed to me was the freedom it attached to old age, not having to adhere to the social graces that bind us. And this then is my piece. When I am old. When I am old, I aspire to be like my grandmother Bhrádaigh, with her joie de vivre and her kind ways. I will read from morning until night if I so wish. I will rise when I choose and listen to beautiful music. I will continue with my red wine habit and on occasion drink pints of Guinness in the pub. I will travel and have new adventures. Husband wants us to spend a year travelling around France in a camper van. It'll be the making or the breaking of us. When I'm old, I will set myself new challenges. I will swim in the sea as often as I can, take the ferry boat from Cleggan to Inishbofin, hang out with my adult children, enjoy the company of friends. I want to grow old. My parents were robbed of this. They both died at 65. I want to grab as much as I can of this life. When I am old, I will love myself for who I am, not try to change who I am, finally accept myself for who I am, be happy to be me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Caroline. It's such a wise and inspiring piece, actually. I mean, I love the line, "I want to grab as much as I can of this life." And I mean, that's through the whole piece. So thank you very much. And now it's Meadhbh's turn. Maeve is going to read an I Am Amazed piece, I think. There you are.
Good evening. My name is Maeve Brady. I come from the Midlands in Ireland. The prompt was, "I am amazed at how old I am." And when I heard the words, just an avalanche of memories came back to me. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. I am amazed. I am amazed that I am from a childhood of coasting down the steep, snow-covered hill of our town on homemade wooden slats called sleighs. Milk delivered daily from the local farm in a milk can. Sneaking rides on the bicycles of country folk whilst they buried themselves in the secret dimness of the Alpha Cinema. I am amazed that I blobbed and blobbed with pen and ink before the biro gained its hold. That the annual dental visitor examined, pulled our teeth in the school porch, and sent us back to class. I am amazed that I had a father who was a veteran in the War of Independence, slow to voice the memories in the corridors of his mind. I listened hard, but little was said. Too late the questions now, unanswered in this decade of centenaries. I am amazed at how I skimmed from the best of times to the worst of times, at my artlessness, which now embroiders memories of light and shade.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm amazed at how good it sounds for the second or the third time. And I'm amazed at how useful it is to repeat that I am amazed so often through the piece. Extremely effective technique. Thank you very much. So now it's Pauline Dolan, and Pauline is going to read a letter to Nuala. And I think Pauline will contextualize this for us. If you would, Pauline.
Yeah, thanks, Éilís. I hope I can be heard all right. I was kind of not nervous coming up to this, and then I'm thinking, oh my God, it's the realization that it's live and that I'm talking to people that I don't know. So I felt really safe in the context of the group. And in some way, that's kind of the context, you know, that I felt that I pushed my own sense of self in answering the question, are you somebody? And yeah, it did take some vulnerability, but it was a very safe place. So yeah, it's not that this is unsafe, but it is public, or it's a bit more. So it's it was chapter 17 of Are You Someone? And it was prefaced by a late fragment by Raymond Carver, and it's just a poem. And did you get what you wanted from this life? Even so. And I believe that Raymond Carver was actually dying of cancer at that stage, and happily he was able to say, yeah, I did get to call myself beloved, beloved on the earth. So that's the context of chapter 17 of the novel. Well, it's a memoir of Dear Nuala, or Are You Someone? Nuala of Wayland's, certainly internationally acclaimed as it happened. So, Dear Nuala, like you, I don't have to give an account for myself at all. Something in me has always wanted to answer your question, are you somebody? I know your question was asked in the context of being recognised as someone having an extra dimension, the commonly accepted distinction between being a somebody and a nobody. Like you, I remember Brendan O'Donnell and what happened to him. A tragedy waiting to happen is what Tony and J.J. Muddigan called their book, highlighting how they had failed to help him. Tragic too was the death of John Carthy, who was shot dead in Abbey Lowry in 2000. There was an outrage at the stupidity of how that was handled. It came out afterwards that his sister wasn't allowed to speak to him or bring him cigarettes. He asked for the solicitor, Pat Finucane, to be contacted, but that never happened. Maybe there's a time that comes when being a nobody tips some people over the edge, and they find themselves in circumstances out of their depth, and the world of nobodies merge, dreamlike, into the world of somebodies, and from there the story could go one way or the other. It's hard to believe that John Carthy didn't want a different outcome. It's easy to believe he did. Why else would he call on somebody he believed could save him? He didn't turn the gun on himself or others. He was shot by the state, the guardians of the peace. That was a tragedy, a shame that it had to happen. It was a shame too that your brother, the one that was sent to England for you to mind, ended up hating and blaming himself. That's what happens when we feel like a nobody in a world that rewards the status of somebodies, those that have managed to make something of themselves. Your account of spending Christmas on your own in Clare makes explicit the belief that you didn't expect to get what you wanted. You gave the example of your friends chatting and sharing themselves with each other, and you wondered what happened to me. It is a tragedy that you believed you were fractured. You said that, well, that was how you experienced yourself. That autumn, you stayed in the small village in the Pyrenees. You said the event of looking at the teenagers playing a kind of badminton until it was too dark to make out the white shuttlecock wouldn't have been different if there had been someone there. There would have been a whole us there instead of a fractured thing with me, by myself, knowing that my solitary self was observing the scene. By collectively becoming aware of our personal scripts, we can educate Cinderella not to wait for the prince. convince her she is capable of resolving her own problems, eventually agreeing new values for old stories, restoring the survival of the fittest beyond comparison and competition, to be replaced by cooperativeness and personal values and fulfillment. It's not wrong to dream about our ideal anything, but the belief of being incomplete until it happens is. We're good enough to be in charge of our destiny, to be our own saviour. So, dear Nuala, closing the gap between somebodies and nobodies in society isn't something I need to resolve. Like you, figuring out my own story is enough. I hope you got to feel beloved in the end. I'm grateful I did before the end. Sinead?
Sinead, thank you so much, Pauline. And as Pauline explained, we read Nuala Fhailán, a chapter from Nuala's Are You Somebody, the introductory part, which was part of this wonderful reader that Michaela and Maggie and Karen had put together for the focus groups, which kind of preceded the writing workshops. And Pauline, I thought was, of course, the workshops were about writing, but they was very much about talking and, what people said, and the discussions were so inspiring. And I think Pauline I've asked the question that comes up in Nuala, who am I? And it kind of reminded me that we're still asking this question that we were asking when we were 15 or 20. We're still asking it at the age of 70 or 60 or 80. And just very thought-provoking, Pauline was. Great, thanks. And so now we're going to hear from one of our great poets in the group, and that's Mary Rafferty, and she's going to read 2 poems, I think, Attunement and another one. Hi, Mary.
Hi. The context of this, I'll say a little bit about the prompt that Éilís gave us, but when I was listening today, I was thinking that in rejecting the stereotype that aging is all about loss, there's a risk that we stop acknowledging that aging does involve loss, and that some of that loss can be a gain as well. So the falling away of the kind of preoccupations and concerns and attachments. I think Caroline talked about the social graces. So being free not to conform to those. So I think the prompt, one of the pieces that we had in our reader was from Penelope Lively in her memoir, Ammonites and Leaping Fish. And there was a line in that Éilís gave us, which was, with those old consuming vigors now muted, something else comes into its own, an almost luxurious appreciation of the world you are still in. So this poem was made in response to that prompt. Attunement. There is more of it, and still more, and every day more green, more lush, more varied, more live, buzzing, bursting, shimmering with growth, lavish, lascivious, luxuriant, leaves and blossoms and swelling, bursting, brash, bellowing, blazing. And beneath and beyond, quiet, creeping tendrils and curls unfold. Perfect fractals dazzle the eye. I drink it in. I breathe life in. I open to the flood of incessant, insistent life. I stand on the earth, rooted and grounded, made of the same clay, stardust energy, as much a part of the galaxy as any star. I wonder, gasp with the abundance of it all, laugh with abandon, fizz with excitement at being alive in the world, at being alive to the world. Thank you.
Are you going to read another poem?
Yeah, I wasn't sure if it came now or later, but I could certainly do it now.
I think we said at the end. Will we do that at the end?
Okay.
Because it's
Sorry about
such
that.
a
Yeah,
fitting
so
poem for the end.
So thanks a million. Yeah, that was such a luxuriant poem, abundant, and yeah, all the beauty of May Bealtaine is in the poem. And yeah, I'd forgotten that it was in response to that Penelope Lively prompt. So fantastic. Thank you so much, Mary. And Maeve is going to also, I think the next piece is also from Maeve, is also in response to that. Yeah, those great lines by Penelope Lively in her memoir. So Maeve, can we hear from you now, please?
Right. I have to admit that I had never heard of Penelope Lively, but one of the things that she writes about in her memoir is the importance of objects and the importance of things that happen in the moment and her response. So the quote that I have taken is, "I've seen all this before, done all this, but I'm somehow able to find new and sharpened pleasure." The 22nd of May 1999 was box office for the Dolan Club in Columkill Parish in North Longford. In conjunction with Age and Opportunity, we were hosting a Bealtaine event. The theme that year was connecting with our heritage. We had gauged for 200 guests along with our own members. What a shock to see buses and more buses roll in from all over the county, emptying out one by one almost 600 people. The older brigade had come, all shapes and sizes, people with sticks, wheelchairs, able-bodied and strong, frail and friendly, grannies, granddads, carers, helpers, entertainers, caterers, all dressed up to the knocker for this special outing. The nearby church was the venue for an intergenerational prayer service planned by the youth of the area. Then all adjourned to the community hall. The music struck up, with local accordion players and fiddlers, balladeers, the Éilís singers. The sun shone brilliantly, adding lustre to the bright faces of the hordes of giddy folk who wandered down memory lanes, opening up before them. Now appears a replica of a country kitchen, with its cast iron kettle singing on the hearth fire. Sitting snugly beside the blaze was the creel of turf, a washboard and a bath pan. In the corner, a settle bed. Box tea and soda bread making were in full swing. The wooden dresser in the corner displayed a Wedgwood set of plates, cups and saucers. Big blue-ringed mugs stood gleaming on the dresser. The women got their turn to sit on the stools, nattering as of old, their faces lit up with the chatter. A Bealtaine fire blazed outside in the adjoining field, alongside an exhibition of ploughing. 2 horses drawing a plough tossed the brown earth back and forth with gusto, bringing to mind the lines of the poet Corey Cullum from this very parish. Sunset and silence. A man, earth savage, earth broken. Beside him, 2 horses a plough. The king of the Loy, Mike, a local name, showed how to dig a Pareto drill with a Loy. Back inside, an old-fashioned chemist had all sorts of liniments, bandages, herbs and invocations. A wise woman told of the cures in dandelions, dockens, crab apples and nettles. giving a little tincture to plucky mortals longing for relief from aches and pains. Old-fashioned proverbs hung on the walls. An old hen with a pullet's head. A wrinkled purse is a wrinkled face. It's hard to get wool of a goat. It's a long road that has no turn. Laughter rang around the place as memories gave voice to more and more foolish and wise quotes for the collection. Fashions of yesteryear were modelled from the Edwardian period. Shawls, long coats, hats, waistcoats, pantaloons of their youth, to the 1990s styles of flares and platforms, beehive hairstyles and crew cups. A huge famine pot had been unearthed from a ditch and was on display, which reminded one and all of harsher times. Besides this were all sorts of smaller farm implements: turnip washer, pounder, flail, rubber. The men took them in their gnarled hands to eyeball them and give them a handy squish. The hours flew as they reminisced. I mind the time when they were all young again. They were part of the Meadhbh as they bantered and shared their ramblings with one another. Tasted the crusty corned bread, lathered with churned butter and a hot mug of scalding tea. Indeed, for that carefree day, lonesomeness was forgotten. It's worth quoting again the writer of the opening title. I've seen all this before, I've done all this, but I'm somehow able to find new and sharpened pleasure. Bealtaine had done its job, revisiting the past through togetherness, shared memories and heritage. It had brought this gathering fully home to themselves.
Thank you. Wow. Such riches in these writings. I mean, that was just, something I emphasize as Maeve, and they all know, is the thingness of things and the concreteness and how that can bring a piece alive. I mean, you're there at that Bealtaine event that Maeve is remembering. But I think it wasn't just the things, it's remembering what people said and the proverbs and everything. It's fantastic. It's fantastic memoir. And it also, the pieces were mainly that actually the prompts are from other writing, from Penelope Lively, from Alice Munro, from Nuala Fuelon, etc. And it kind of does indicate to me how one story, one great piece of writing leads to another, and the great inspiration and the way to learn to write is reading these great writings. So thanks a million, Maeve. And and now I am going to read from Teresa Mason's letter to herself. This was actually just a letter to my 20-year-old self was the prompt in this case. And unfortunately, Teresa cannot be with us today because, as Mary said, loss is part of it, and Teresa is at the funeral of her uncle-in-law, I think. So this is Teresa's letter. Dear Teresa, don't worry. You will lose your virginity and there will be plenty of sex, mostly good. Trust your gut about men. It serves you. That guy you still pine after was never for you. There was no amount of self-improvement that would change that. In the future, women your age will not wait for a man to call the shared phone in the hall. Worse than that, they will be able to build up an idea about him from what we call social media and track his activity and on a handheld computer that doubles as a phone. You might be on the wrong college course. You fail your final exams. No one dies. And though you pass in the autumn, you never really shake this confirmation of your status as not quite as good as expected. You will spend much of your adult life in education, possibly to compensate. Don't work in a hospital. It's not the place for you. You're better off in the community, helping people where they live. It doesn't have the status of the institution, but it's more real, although you will be taken for granted, as are many good people. Get over yourself. Respect your parents, they're paying for your education. You don't have to let them know that you feel disappointed that they watch the lottery programme on Friday nights when you return from Trinity. They're good enough. Your brother and sisters grow in importance in your life as you age. You're very lucky there, you just haven't realised that yet. You will never own a home in Ranelagh. You won't believe this now, but you go back to where you are, where you're from, to raise your children. That place also grew when you were away. It's what you can afford. However, the train is excellent, and this is just as well. Your batteries need the charge of the city. In your 40s, you will develop a love for the rural landscape and an interest in history and old ruins. In all seriousness, you will. You do follow up your current curiosity about the root causes of mental difficulties. You sit for 8 years in a circle with a slowly changing group, and all the givens of life are questioned. You learn and you unlearn. Each decade brings up an upheaval of this nature when foundations rattle. It's the same for everybody, I guess. You only learn about your own creative abilities when people mirror it back to you. Creativity is a resource for living. Invest in playing, exploring, experimentation. It doesn't have to lead to anything to be important for you. You will have a future as a blonde. You will find that what you're wearing now is back in fashion in your 50s. Don't buy too many clothes. Buy less but better. You're not going to listen to me. You will hoard. The planet is suffering. Please stop smoking. There's no right way to have a baby. You buy a lot of books about it. In fact, you buy a book for every problem. You have a huge library. In the Ireland of the future, gay people can marry. Women can access abortions. They give out free condoms in college, and Lidl provides free sanitary products. You will come to understand what Lidl is. A virus will come along, and ordinary life is affected for 2 years. We manage, but we'll be dealing with the consequences for a long time to come. An annihilating war is a strong possibility for your future. It again feels as much like a possibility as it did to you as a teenager. Smash the patriarchy. It has a lot to answer for. At least start to observe how it operates and pitches you against other women. Remember too that power is played for by the woke. Woke means people who understand the right way to behave and think, but this doesn't guarantee simple kindness and respect. Remember, people usually do their best. Having said that, Ireland is full of grubby secrets, but the wrongdoings come out eventually. Many people are nursing wounds. Teresa, I'm aware now that I have been giving you the benefit of my advice and insights gained through experience. I hope I'm not a disappointment to you. This advice will wash through you like water through a sieve, because no one can tell you, really, and though you are pierced with anxiety and fiery desire, you also think you know everything. Now, you didn't think I was going to go soft on you and tell you you're great and have loads of potential, did you? Do things. Think about things. Do things. A few good friends are enough, and you will always have a few. Much love, Teresa, aged 51. So that's Teresa Mason's letter to herself, aged 20. And in Nish, it's Kathryn Daly, who is going to read 2 poems, and Kathryn will tell us about them. Hi, Kathryn.
Hey there. You can hear me okay? Excuse me. I'm an American blow-in living in Donegal. I came to Ireland to go to art school in Dublin and then came to Donegal for the babysitters. And I've spent most of the time since as a 20-something years as a single parent. And I really want to thank everybody that was involved with organizing the course and the facilitation and the people that participated. It was fantastic and inspiring. So what came up for me a little bit during this was the way that aging has involved so much, so often has involved grief and grieving. I know it's been mentioned a little bit already. And it's kind of a lifelong accumulation of losses. So I just, this one I've wrote about my father's loss, but kind of also the absurdity of things that happened after he died. I was here, so it was long distance, and that was hard too. Anyway, and then I have the second one is a little bit to bring us up out of the grief a little bit. So funny how grief can burrow in deep down like a worm, like a prickly sea urchin or some exotic parasite, lay its eggs, sow its seeds, deposit bulbs of sleeping sorrow, and then settle down to just wait you out. At first you think it's just the shock that has you numb, brain jumbled to mush, words misspelled, misplaced, and the world disappearing as if down a tunnel, something to be seen from a greater distance, from further back inside your head. You think it's just shock as you skitter merrily along, making the necessary preparations, the necessary old friend phone calls, spend hours on the line with distant relatives who dominate your morning with their tales of remembrance, stories you never heard until now about how their father abused them and their mother was unkind to your grandmother. You think it's because of the shock, the lack of immediate feeling, the absence of a sense of loss as you and your sister giggle before sleep at the thought of inheriting an ostrich farm in the middle of nowhere, Texas, or the lack of adult supervision as y'all pick one of his punchlines as an inscription on the VA gravestone, leave hieroglyphic messages to him in gold Sharpie on the bottom of his urn. You are sure it's just the shock, even though you've known and expected this inevitable day since you were 17 and sitting alone on the floor in your student apartment in Vancouver, Washington, waiting for a ring from the ICU in Indianapolis. And partly, of course, it is the shock, at least for a little while, even for a little longer than you'd expect, a little longer than might feel normal. But then it goes on and on and on, and still you don't feel anything different. No loss. The rumpled familiar love still tucked warmly away beneath your heart. And then out of nowhere, maybe even 3 years or so later, a friend posts a picture of bright tulips in rainbowed fields, not too far from his house in Laconner, that sets the sorrowful seeds sprouting in an instant, and grief suddenly appears in the fullness of bloom, as if you were watching a time-lapse nature documentary depicting the raw ravages of climate change without the soothing voice of Richard Attenborough. So the second one is a little bit for balance. I missed some sessions of our group because I was getting married. So I'm 65, and that was not something at 40 or 50 I would have expected, especially after all the single years. And funny enough, we met at a Bealtaine writing workshop with Jennifer Johnston here in Letterkenny 14 years ago. So that was also the anniversary of that we celebrated with the date of our wedding. And it was also the same year that I had a poetry collection published called The Comfort of a Wicked Past. So now I'm working on more wicked present. And I think mature love is different. Some people keep asking me why now, why'd you get married now? And it was like, well, it took a long time for us both to be 19 at the same time. He's 10 years older than I am. And I think there's something about the paradox of being able to look at a person and actually still see the 19-year-old that you never knew in their eyes. So this is called How He Courted Me. He reached out his hand toward my cheek and gently touched the part of me that age could not. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. That's fantastic. Yeah. Yeah, it was wonderful, wonderful poems. And it was so exciting when you told us you weren't going to be able to attend the next time because you were getting married. There are all kinds of things happen in creative writing workshops. Yeah, that was lovely. The long one and the short one, the grief and the stunning, as somebody says. The chat box is full of the most wonderful compliments to you and to everyone. Okay, so now it's Maeve again, I think. Maeve, if you didn't know what age you are, or would you like to wait until after I read Tricia's piece?
Yes.
You would like to wait, yeah, okay. So one of the wonderful contributors was Patricia Cronin, who can't be with us today because she's traveling. And I'm going to read her I am amazed from the Alice Munro. I'm amazed sometimes to think how old I am. It's very self-explanatory. I am amazed sometimes to think how old I am. I can remember the dense London fogs, pea soupers, before burning coal was banned by the Clean Air Act. That was in 1956, so I must have been 3 or 4, walking to nursery school, holding on to the big old pram, carrying my brother and sister, or clutching my mother's hand. We lived in Fulham, near a busy street market and a parade of shops. The fog greyed out all colour and muffled the usual morning sounds. The shop lights formed a ghostly haze as we walked along, only able to see a few inches ahead, slowly navigating the narrow, busy pavement with figures looming through the musk around us. I don't remember being frightened, but did feel disgust at the black stuff that came out of my nostrils later. Fulham in the 1950s seemed mostly grey and drab, shabby and grubby, and the fogs were part of that. So too was not having a bathroom. I remember going to take a bath in the municipal baths just over the road, where my mum also did the family's washing. Later, she used the laundrette until she had the luxury of our own twin tub, and we had that for many years. Our house was small and narrow, part of a house we shared with an old lady called Mrs. Banyard, with only a tiny walled backyard surrounded by high brick walls. So we were often taken to the park, spending hours on end there in the summer, in the playgrounds and greenery of Eelbrook Common or the much bigger Bishop's Park, which ran alongside the Thames. I loved the special clean smell of the water at high tide. Once we saw the rigging of a small yacht caught in the overhanging trees and some bystanders trying to help untangle it. Why did that sight scare me so much? I didn't want to stay to watch it float free, and I remember the urgency with which I tried to make my mother move away. I was disturbed too by the pet shop on a corner we passed on our walk to Bishop's Park. Sometimes there was a sad-faced caged monkey in the window. I would try to hurry us past, but couldn't help looking at him too, and remember how his huge brown eyes followed us. And that's, Tricia told us that she hadn't finished the piece, but I think that's really a very good thing because, I mean, this is writing, it's just so wonderful and the memories are so wonderful that I would hope Tricia and the other participants in the workshop would just go on writing and, you know, continue later afterwards. The workshop was just 4 sessions out of your life, but your lives will continue, and you have been triggered to remember all kinds of things. So I would hope that people will go on writing afterwards. So and now there are 2 pieces left, Maeve and Mary. So Maeve, yes, it's if you didn't know what age you were, and then it will be Mary Rafferty again with her poem.
I think this piece is against stereotyping older people. If you didn't know what age you were, what age would you say you were? That's the slogan that came out many years ago for a dedicated year of older people. I put it up on my desk. It emblazoned itself in my brain. For me, it begs the question and answers it, that at different times, with different events, and with different people, I can be all manner of ages. In spring, I am brimming with energy, digging in the garden, foraging in forests for wild garlic, thrilled to accept the offer of a boat ride on the local lake, eager to join friends and family for simple outings and picnics. Last year, seeing the brown earth of the flat bogland, which we have in the Midlands, I yearned to run across the peat in my bare feet. I was out of sight of the world. It was the most luscious of experiences, to be bottled in my senses, for revisiting on later grey and rainy days. I was grateful to be alive. Summer also calls for bright colours and slingback shoes. It's the season when young and old can act the peacock and strut their stuff. It's a time for paradoxes and silliness, a time for pink and yellow and all sorts of mismatch. For me as an elder, to act middle-aged or even young. The time, as Jenny Joseph says, when people who know me are not too shocked or surprised. It is my time too for peering into the hot press and attacking a few hefty washes of bed linen, towels, clothing, anything that can be washed, and hung out for days on end to freshen them up, as my mother would say. As autumn rolls on, I become aware of the falling leaf and the pervading mellowness. I am a little more subdued. Visits to the library increase. The summer gear is shelved. Lavender balls put between the layers of all that's stacked away. I return to the garden a little sadder and with less gusto, to empty the pots and dehead the roses. The shortening days bid me to share longer quality time with those who are housebound and frail. How am I in winter? As I grow into older age, winter invades my psyche more acutely. It is a time of warm escape from the fast lane, a time of blazing fires, contemplation, books, crosswords, and unashamed idleness. Not for me, though, the boast of a swim in sea or lake. Yoga, as the Scandinavians call it, is the time to cozy up, light the candles, and give oneself permission to slow down. The ideal season to be in tune with nature. The squirrels, moles, bees, and hedgehogs hibernate. The birds more or less silence their song, and the trees become denuded of their leaves. On the human side, the wintry season teases us, and sometimes makes an exhibition of our jerky arthritic limbs. I applaud the great Thomas Merton, who had a strong love and insight into the seasons, when he says, I can only desire this absurd business of the trees that say nothing. I am happy as a coot, and I cannot explain it.
Oh, thank you. That says it all. I mean, the seasons of the year almost as a metaphor for life, and just that delight in the luxuriance of nature. Again, as Penelope Lively said, your senses maybe get more intense in some ways as time goes on. So that was just marvelous. Thank you, Maeve. Really wonderful stuff. And now finally, we're going to close with a poem from the magnificent Mary Rafferty.
You're on mute, Mary.
You're on mute, Mary. Yeah, there you go.
How do I get my poem back again? I wrote this after the workshop, almost immediately after the end of the fourth workshop. I was just so aware of how precious that time had been, how amazing that opportunity, the support, the encouragement, the connections that we had made. And I was sitting in this kind of stunned realization that I have everything I need, that this is at my fingertips. It's this pleasure and joy and frustration of writing is available to me all of the time, which was an astonishing revelation. So this poem was born out of a really moment of clarity about what I need. What I don't need. I don't need scarves, neither those of garish colours nor those carefully chosen for grey hair and older skin. Hand cream, candles or scented room diffusers, tiny cacti in novelty planters, artwork created by small children, photographs, no matter how cute, even of those I love. Beautiful ceramic bowls, another vase. The must-have spice, flavouring or food, even if it's artisan, local or limited edition. A cookery book, a recipe, any summary of someone else's life lessons. Any doodah to put on any surface, no matter what it's made of, where it's made, or what mystical, transformative, or liberating process is involved. Anything with a strapline, logo, or inspiring message making reference to my one wild and precious life. Chocolate made on an island that can only be accessed twice a year using beans that grow inside out with salt mined from prehistoric landfills. An app. Advice on decluttering. A book on Swedish death cleaning. Earrings or any jewellery. Assumptions about my views, beliefs, experience. Recommendations for TV programs, podcasts, restaurants, sites, or experiences. What I need. Smiles, laughter, good jokes, time, interesting and challenging ideas, hard questions, music, art, poetry, good poetry, written with skill and care. Walks on city streets, in urban parks, on beaches, on gentle hills. Long wandery lunches. City breaks. Beauty. Things to make and hold, to give away. To be asked. To be held in mind. To be stretched and used. Wonder at the mundane and everyday. Beginnings. Unfinished business.
Thank you, Mary. Yeah, well, I just need to read, instead of responding myself, Mary, your poem sums up so much. This is brilliant. I love this great grand finale for the creative writing group, Mary. Bloody good stuff, and fabulous, and you made my day, and wonderful, and bravo. So really fantastic. Thanks, Mary, and bravo to everyone for today's amazing performance, and for your sort of committed and enthusiastic participation in those workshops, which were very intensive. 3-hour workshops twice a week over 2 weeks, and so much writing, Kate. I mean, you wrote so much during those 2 weeks. It really is astonishing. The energy, the creativity, and the hard work that went into it all. So I think I'll hand you back. Go back now to Michaela or Maggie.
Thanks so much, Éilís. Really, well, I think we're all blown away by this. It's been a brilliant reading. I mean, we knew the pieces in advance, but hearing them read out by the writers is something totally different, obviously. And I think we had a quick meeting last week with the participants of the workshop, and Maggie, Karen, and I. And we said that when we started out with the project, of course, we had no way of knowing where it would go, because usually if you're a researcher, then, or what we usually do, at least what I usually do, would be I would look at writing and then I would analyze and interpret it and write about it. But this was something entirely different, and we had no way of knowing whether it would work out, especially the workshop, the creative writing workshop element. That was really experimental for us, and it has worked out so well in so many ways. Not only the wonderful, amazing results, creative results that we just heard, but also the positive feedback and the great collaborative atmosphere and spirit that you all mentioned. So that makes the whole project, I think, worthwhile and a huge success. And I think I would just like to to stop speaking myself and just to give the word to anyone who would like to say something about the workshop experience, to anyone in the audience who would like to ask questions, and also perhaps refer back to the talks we heard in the first part where we didn't really have time for discussion. So anyone at all who would like to say something, feel free to do so. We still have like half an hour.
Well, I'll say something.
Yes, please.
I just saw this. I'm on the Moore Institute's mailing list, and so I just saw this and thought I would try to come. And I'm kind of surprised at how much I've learned from coming, especially, well, the keynote speaker really helping me see my internalized ageism was very great, and then to see all of this, well, to see this community of people that are imagining aging in new ways, in different ways, and I want to cry like everyone else because it's just I needed to know this community was out there. So this is just a thank you.
Thanks so much for this. Thank you. Yeah, and imagining aging, I think that is the important bit that's something we meant to say at the start of the second half, because sometimes people ask why are the workshops and why is this project on women aged 50 and older, because it's such a broad range. So we had contributors ranging from 50 to actually 80 in the workshop. But it's really not just about being. It's so problematic to even say that, to be old, because it has so many negative overtones, as Ashton pointed out, but really also to imagine yourself growing into older age, and that for women that very often starts at the age of 50, that you begin to notice changes in your body, and that you notice that people start to perceive you in a different way when you say, okay, I'm 50 now. That makes a difference somehow. And to imagine and to get the experience from older women and to actually have that kind of dialogue, and that is also kind of even intergenerational dialogue between women in their early 50s and in their 80s. I think that is really important. So the idea of imagining age in a positive way and not always as a scary kind of specter looming somewhere and people telling you that you have to hide your age and the physical signs of your aging. Anyone else who would like to share their thoughts from perhaps the workshop participants or also anyone else in the audience?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm. Yes, please.
I came here online through, I'm writing my thesis in creative nonfiction on aging and ageism, and my advisor, Ilana Bloomberg in Israel, advised me to come here, and I'm so blown away. I'm writing about Alicia Ostreicher, an 85-year-old poet, who's poet laureate of New York, and she had recommended a book, a wonderful book, called A Story Larger Than My Own, Older Writers Looking Back on Their Writing Lives. And Erica Jung, I think she's 80, has a piece, and here comes my question, is it's very lovely that everyone's sharing their memoirs, but how is the reading public receiving it? And she writes that I never expected to get this old, certainly not old enough to be in an anthology about women writing of a certain age. In some ways we never age, she writes. I get as excited about writing a poem as I ever did. The question is whether other people get as excited about poems about aging as they do about poems of first love. The subjects that interest us as we age are often invisible to the young. So just that's my question in big is, how is the literature of older women received by a younger readership?
Thanks so much. That's a brilliant question. Can I just, anyone else might want to answer this, but perhaps just from my own experience, because last year I actually taught on the Master for Comparative Literature that we have here in NUI Galway. And I taught a section in a module that was titled Narratives of Aging and Dementia it was. And the students were all in their 20s, some were slightly older, but mainly in their 20s, and they were blown away by it. They were blown away by reading about aging, by reading narratives, by older writers and featuring older characters. And a lot of them came to me afterwards and said, well, we have been studying literature for years, but aging has never really featured as a topic. And we have one of the students said to me that he took a course on critical approaches to literature, and he learned all about women as cyborgs, but he never learned about women as older people or older women. And I found that very telling. There was a huge interest there, and actually 3 participants from that module decided to write their master thesis about aging-related topics afterwards. So I think the interest is certainly there. It's definitely there. Perhaps anyone else would like to give
I've had a very positive response in a class. I remember a creative writing class of mostly young people in their 20s, and I remember one of a novel that we read and discussed was a great novel called Mrs. Palfrey at the Claremont by Elizabeth Taylor, which I hadn't thought of actually in connection with our workshop, but now it comes back to me. It is about aging, about Mrs. Palfrey is old and she moves into this hotel, the Claremont Hotel, where there are a lot of old people. Also, it's kind of set in the 1940s or 50s, I think. But but they loved it. Yeah, some of the students, picked it out as the novel they wanted to write about, and that was a novel now rather than a memoir. But there was no, there was no impatience with it because it's about a woman aged 80 or 75 or something. I don't know how it would be outside the classroom, though, whether they'd actually buy the book if they weren't if it wasn't on a reading list.
Okay.
But certainly when presented with it, they liked it and were interested.
I would like to say something. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, I wasn't sure. I'd like to say something which is inside out of this in a way, that I think all through this thing we've been talking about writing about ageing when we are ageing, and I have a problem with my readers, and I'll tell you what it is. I'm actually writing. I've written 2 novels and poems. These are all looking back. I was writing from my 50s and 60s, I've got older than that now, about things which happened to me when I was young. I'm not talking about memoir, I'm talking about using the experiences. And the interesting thing to me is that women of 35 to 40 to 50 don't understand. They sort of say, well, what is this about? No, it's not the culture. I think it is because, I'm not worried about this in particular, but it's quite interesting about it. As we get older, we see into things in a different way. We maybe, from our experience, we can understand what we didn't understand when we were 20, 30 or whatever. When we write about it and expect them to understand it, they don't. They say, why are you thinking, what's she doing? Why is she thinking that? Do you get what I'm saying? You don't, do you? Everybody's silent.
Hi, Claire. This is just one of the participants, and just jumping in and say, I hear you. I hear your excitement, and I've just written down, as we get older, we know stuff from other perspectives. And that's certainly my sense of the richness of what came from the really listening to each other, you know, that there was a depth or a dimension beyond the words, you know. It wasn't political in that way. It wasn't clever. It happened in the moment. And the writing happened in the moment, so it was, as someone else called it, newborn writing, you know. So that was the joy of it. There was something very profound and healing. That's what I experienced, you know. It was a happening, it was an experience. I think Maeve said it in her piece that I hadn't heard the first time, and it was something about we came together and got what we wanted out of it. So yeah, so just say hello, Claire. I'm down in the south of Ireland, and kind of we all have just a universal, maybe not the same voice, but we individuate, and we have different voices and different expressions, but we are women, you know.
I was quite interested that when I was 50, I did write about when we're crones, we'll wear purple. That was quite funny. But it is interesting that somebody say, well, I'm not quite sure what this is. This is it. What is it? Why is it mysterious? You know, and I can see exactly why it's mysterious. And I think this is because of being older and having the experience to look at the thing as a 3D experience rather than just the excitement of the time. Anyway, I'll shut up now.
Could I just jump in here and say something? I just think that it's a bit like before you have a baby, people are telling you things and you can't imagine what it's like till you actually deliver the child. Oh, sorry, am I muted? No. And so I just think that actually aging is unimaginable till you get there. And so younger people can't even imagine what you're talking about in a lot of cases. And when you get to 50 and you kind of lose your periods or whatever, you think, oh gosh, somebody, hang on a second, there's a new age coming along or whatever. And even then it doesn't dawn in completely. So it's a bit like being a teenager again. You're just kind of figuring out who you are again. And I think that in a lot of cases, younger people are so busy with other bits of their life that aging to them is just, they see it as a kind of grey patch. And certainly I used to dread being 50. And I mean, I'm a long way from 50 now. But I used to think that 50 was kind of like sort of the end of the line. and that after that, you know, it was all downhill. I couldn't have imagined what a great patch it was. And so I just think that for the more people we have like you, Claire, or like anybody else who's actually trumpeting it and saying, hey, this is some great stuff around the corner or whatever, or even the whole idea that just we let our voices out. It's marvelous to actually see it. And for myself, I'm trying my best, but I actually have a lot of younger friends. And I think that that's a big key to it, is actually just to make sure that you don't end up in one block, so that you actually have a crossover. Who was talking earlier about cross-generational encounters, if you like? Those matter hugely. But thank you, Claire, that was great.
Yeah, I'm not talking about saying well, I'm not saying that I'm writing about old age now. I'm saying I'm actually, the book I'm writing at the moment is actually more like a YA thing, and I'm writing it in the first person. What I'm saying is, because you are older and you've had experience, and this was the belief that people used to have when they honoured old age, you have more to say. And so you say it, but people say, well, I've never thought about it from that angle, and they perhaps don't even want to think about it from that angle.
I think my sense of it from, you know, meeting these wonderful people in the workshops here and another workshop I did recently in the Irish Writers' Centre on memoir writing, is that older people as writers have more confidence than younger people. This may sound not flattering, but their characters are sort of formed. Although we talked about asking who am I and so on, they kind of know who they are, and I feel that sort of sense of self and self-confidence help. You know, they're not afraid of saying what they think, or of writing it in a way that maybe, I think self-censorship is not a kind of issue with them, maybe in a way that it can be with younger people. And they're also maybe not that, you know, as Mary in her wonderful poem, I can extrapolate some things from it. They don't care what anyone thinks, you know. They're not out to impress, and as a result, the stuff is really good, you know. So I think there's a great freedom. In fact, I'm just going to read a tiny bit from Tricia's letter to self, or thinking about herself when she was younger. Waking up on a glorious sunny May morning, I straight away started thinking about what I would say to my 20-year-old self. At 20, my time was my own, as without family or work responsibilities, but just as now without family. So in a way, by the time you get to be about 70, your life may be more like it was when you were 20 than it has been at any time in between, you know. So there's that kind of great freedom, I think, which was emphasized by people in our workshop.
Yes, I think that's right, and I think you do have the confidence, and you have the confidence actually not to want to be confined by what people imagine somebody of that age should be like.
Yes, and also you may feel, I want to tell people what life is like now before I, you know, head off.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I had somebody asked a question in the chat that I said which is there a difference between life writing, autobiography, and memoir? And well, I think there is a difference between autobiography and memoir. I think I would feel, yeah, in autobiography, you're going to try and cover the life. You know, I was born in 1954 and lived here and moved on through it. Of course, you probably won't be able to cover it all anyway. But memoir is much more selective, and so you know, we have memoirs about a year in my life, or certain aspects of my life, or, you know, my life as a writer, or my this illness I suffer through, whatever. So I think memoir is you can be a lot more selective. And in fact you should be more selective. You'll have a theme for your memoir, and I think that was one of the reasons that this workshop worked very well. That we did have a theme, and the theme was restoring aging. Of course, we went back and remembered our youths and so on, but it was kind of it had a coherence thanks to that. And that arose from the whole project and from the focus groups where people have been considering aging and stereotypes and so on and so forth. So in a way, the memoir workshop was themed as memoirs are. And I'm not sure about the difference between, I would think life writing is, covers all of them really. Yeah.
I think it's an umbrella term, isn't it? Life writing that covers all aspects that can also, we have traditional memoirs, autobiographies, biographies, but also the more recent forms of life writing that we try to capture in this webinar, like writing tweets. Tweeting is a form of life writing in that sense, or also visual self-representations on Instagram. All of this would, I think, blog posts, all of this would also be covered under that umbrella term of life writing, in my view. And that was, of course, very well captured by some of the talks in the first half of the seminar, whereas the writing workshop, of course, was more kind of traditional writing, rewriting in memoir form, in poetry form. Are there any other? I think I saw a question earlier by Anne Booth that may have been, you may not want to ask it now, but I think I saw a raised hand. So if you wanted to come in with your question now, Anne, that there would be time for that. And if not, no worries. Yes, and actually, Suzette Henke writes that Julia Watson should actually speak and explain the term life writing. So if she's still here and wanted to come in, that would be brilliant, because she has, of course, worked a lot on that area. Or anyone else who would like to.
When Ellen asked her question about younger women's reactions to the stories, my first reaction to that was to say, what for me, this workshop has opened up a whole new audience of people 50 and over, because we're so used to thinking of audience as across the ages, and to think of how great an audience there is in the over 50s, and reverse the question and ask, what are the reactions of older writers or older audiences to hearing this writing about experience? And I suppose particularly about stories, because my experience, especially in the LGBT community, would be that the young people are hugely interested in the past. And I think for us to write our stories is a way of making history available to young people. So there's a huge intergenerational and cross-generational, I suppose, plus to all of us telling our stories, and all of us looking at each other, as well as, up further in age and down further in age. But I suppose my question is, again, what kind of reaction have you had from older audiences to the writing that we've seen?
I don't know. I think, I would say there must be research and statistics and everything on this, but I would imagine that older readers, that a lot of readers are older people for all kinds of writing, reading, when I think about it, because I belong to a couple of book clubs, and of course, mostly they are people around my age group, and I'm sure many of us will belong to a book club which consists of women of a certain age. They respond well to writing by older people. In fact, what I have found in one of the book clubs that I belong to is that they respond not so well to writing by very young people. They kind of think, "Oh, come on." The concerns of, you say that I'm just using this name because it's the obvious one that comes to the top of your head, of say Sally Rooney or whatever, the kind of emotional traumas of people in their teens or in their 20s become less interesting if you're 70. And in fact, you are more interested in the kind of richness of experience that people who have been around for a longer time have. It's a generalization, but it is based on observation of reactions.
Very good. Thanks, Éilís. I have a question here from Liz Nolan, actually, about the potential of audio. Let me see it again. People who may not wish to write themselves, but who might be facilitated by means of audio recording their experiences. And there's things that might be worth discussing. That has anyone experiences perhaps with that method, audio recording rather than writing? The thing that I am reminded of with that question would be the wonderful project that was also part of the Bealtaine Festival this year, and I think also last year, probably the Mad, Bad and Dangerous project, where women over 70 who had an important role to play in Irish society and changes that happened across the past 50 years or so, interviewed each other and were recorded doing so. So that was not an audio recording, but a video recording, and that can be watched on, or these recordings can be watched on YouTube. And of course, these were also partly writers who have written memoirs and have written themselves to some extent. But I think this is actually a very good, also a form of life writing in that sense, doing interviews and recording. So I think that would be very important and could work very well. So it does not necessarily, I think, have to be creative writing, but it can be done in interview form. If it's about, especially about talking about the past.
I agree. Sorry.
I was going to say, thank you, Michaela. I'm thinking my aunt who's 90, and when I call her and she talks about the loneliness and the isolation and how good it is to hear my voice or to talk, I literally can't get off the phone because she starts to tell me such stories, and I'm writing them down. She's reminiscing and recalling, and I was telling her I was going to this talk today, and I made some reference, and she said, "Isn't the same for women all over?" And this is a woman who's able to give the most minute examples of her life as a 90-year-old woman, and yet is able to place them in a global perspective in terms of the social change. And her knowledge is so rich. She's just a very naturally intelligent woman, but didn't have the benefit of further education. And I know she's got all this rich history to share. She's not going to write it. So my interest is in how to facilitate her in some way, through some guided questions or certain aspects of her life to record her voice. I know this is about the spoken word and literary today. It's not about oral history recording, but I just wonder about the majority of women who never had the chance to go further education, who didn't maybe pursue reading the way many of us here today on the floor have. I wonder about those women and how their stories could be brought to life in some way. I understand it's a little bit naive and a little bit idealistic, but I just thought I'd put the question out there.
Yeah, and I think
Karen, completely important. It's really important, and you should record her. It's easy to record now. I mean, you can record on your phone. You could record it and transcribe it, or you could just record it and somehow preserve the recording, because, of course, the transitoriness and of recordings and photos and everything these days is I think going to be a problem. But no, the to have the story told orally is would be as important really as writing it down. And one of my other hats is as a folklorist, and of course we have been doing this in the National Folklore Collection since 1935, recording people telling their stories, but also talking about their lives. And it's still going on, but not so much. So I think individuals, especially if you know somebody, because you can spot somebody who can tell the tale very well, and this would seem to be one of those cases. Do it. Just do it. Even if you do nothing with it except leave it there in some format on your computer or on a tape that it can be accessed, or send it into the National Folklore Collection.
Well, that's an interesting idea. Oh, no, she's up for it. She's happy to share her story. She's 90. There's a celebration of her birthday shortly. Her other only sister has actually just lost her voice in the last 6 months. And she's my only aunt of my late mum's. And I think how wonderful it would be to be able to listen to her voice. Voice as sensory, as opposed to the written word and concentrating up here, which is wonderful too. It's just a different way.
Yeah, the soul can be in the voice, I often think. I mean, what she has to talk about is probably really important. And if somebody doesn't write it down, or if they don't record it on a sound recording equipment, once the person dies, it's gone. You've heard it probably, but you're going to forget it. That's my experience of things that my parents, I wish I'd recorded more from them. And everyone you talk to has that sort of regret. So do it.
I just want to say there that my daughter did a course through Dublin City Council, I think it was, and it was in oral history. And so it was, she took certain people and interviewed them, and then those were archived within, I'm not really sure exactly what, within Dublin, but it was actually a wonderful course and worth doing. And I'm sure you can probably do it online these days, but I'm sure there's probably one in Kilkenny Council as well. Sorry.
Thanks, Lula.
And lots of great comments in the chat about projects doing this. So check out these comments. We don't have time to read them all out, but there's one raised hand. So I think we'll take a last comment, perhaps. Joe, would you like to go ahead?
Sorry, I'm Aisling. Somehow it defaulted to my husband's Zoom identity. I was just going to say, apropos Liz's question, when I was growing up, I was lucky enough to be looked after by a lady who grew up in the Liberties, finished formal education when she was 12, probably one of the most intelligent people I've ever known, had a great influence on me. And in her later life, I said to her one day, Lizzie, I'd love to write. Everybody says I should write a book about you because all our friends and family knew her. And she said to me, I think that's a very good idea, she said, and it'll be your best book. So I did take down notes from her about her story, and I still have them. But what I eventually did as a way of presenting it was I did it for, I don't know if any of you remember The Quiet Corner. That was a feature on Lyric FM and in the mornings around 11 o'clock, kind of coffee hour. And I did a week of the stories about Lizzie. So I think there are always ways to present stories like this, and they are valuable and definitely worth recording and retaining for the future. So that's just my tuppence halfpence on that.
Thanks
Thank
so much,
you.
Aisling. Thank you. Sorry about the Joe. I should have known from the chat. But yes, anyway, I think we basically are at the end of this afternoon. I can't believe it. That went very fast. Time flew, and I think so many interesting discussions. I can only, perhaps I'll start wrapping this up by just saying thank you to everyone. Thank you to all the speakers of the first part, all the wonderful talks that we had, even though we did not have time to really discuss them, but I think they all came together really well. And the second half with the wonderful, wonderful creative readings. Thanks so much, Éilís, for convening, for doing this this creative writing workshop, and to all the participants also for the courage to read your work out publicly, which is not easy at all. I'm not sure that I could do that. So well done, all of you. And it's really been, well, you got all those positive, wonderful comments. And really, the work you have presented is amazing. And we will certainly, that won't be forgotten. So we will definitely do something with that work in the form of compiling some collection that people can actually read, because someone asked in the chat where you can actually access and reread the texts that have been read out, and we'll definitely do that. It's definitely worth doing that. So thanks everyone, and I don't know, I think I've talked so much, so perhaps I'll just hand over to some of my co-organizers and to Éilís for final words. Thanks everyone.
Yeah, I thank you to everyone in the creative writing workshop for just being so great and committed and interesting, and thanks to everyone who came along. We had a huge audience, and to Michaela and Maggie and Karen for organising the whole thing. Because an awful lot of work and care has gone into this project, which has been going on for a good long time now, a couple of months really, hasn't it? Yeah. So it's really, but it's been extremely rewarding.
Thanks, Éilís.
Do you want to just say something about the recording, or will we send out the link to people afterwards?
Oh yeah, we will, I think, be able to we'll be sending out the link to the recording, which will be available for a limited time, and also then if you'd like to keep in touch with us about updates on the project, just send us an email at ReStorying Aging. So ReStorying Aging that's aging with an E @gmail.com, and we'll if you've got any follow-up queries or anything, you can send them there. And just thank you all so much for coming along today. And I think Michaela and Éilís have said it all really. So just to thank you again.
We should just add that there will be an anthology online and hopefully in hard copy as well of the writing at some stage.
Thank you very much.
That's what we're hoping. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye,
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Well done, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.